All right, everyone, why don't we get started? I want to welcome you all to the third annual conference on the geopolitics of technology in East Asia. My name is Andy Grotto. I founded and co-direct with Colin Kahl the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance at the Center for International Security and Cooperation here at Stanford. I want to thank the Korea Foundation and its president, Gi-won Kim, for the foundation's generous support in making this conference possible. I also want to extend and acknowledge my gratitude to Professor Kiyoshi Tsui, the Japan Studies Program, and the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center for their contributions and support. And last but certainly not least, I want to recognize the team of colleagues running the show here, Eliana Prates, Tenzin Chamfel, Gabby Armani, Kathy Liu, Aya Muratbek, George Mason, Sarah Alvarez, Shabby Tabish, Connor Chapman, and Kelly Remus. Thank you guys very much for all your help this week and in the past couple of weeks for pulling this conference together. Our agenda for the next day and a half is timely. Many of the topics are in the news as we speak. Last week, the Biden administration issued a national security memorandum on artificial intelligence. One of its themes is the importance of working with friends, allies, and partners to establish multilateral rules of the road for safe use of AI while ensuring that people around the world can reap the benefits of safe AI. Two panels tomorrow will explore these issues with experts from industry, academia, and civil society. There's been major political upheaval in Japan this week, with the ruling Liberal Democratic Party losing its longstanding parliamentary coalition majority. What do these political developments mean for the new turn in the Korean and Japanese bilateral relationship and for regional relations more broadly? Tomorrow we'll have an expert panel on Korean and Japanese geopolitical leadership chaired by Professor Tsui. 2 weeks ago, China held a major military exercise around Taiwan, a stark reminder of its revanchism. We have experts on a panel tomorrow discussing the intersection of technology and the military balance of power in the region. The last 2 Octobers, the U.S. has rolled out major export controls on advanced node semiconductors. Here we are, end of October. Feels quiet, almost too quiet. Meanwhile, earlier this month, China's new export controls on rare earths went into effect. Tomorrow, we have an expert panel on what the surge in use of national security trade controls means for the future of free trade principles enshrined in the WTO. It'll be chaired by former senior USTR negotiator and current scholar here at Stanford, Michael Beeman. And to kick tomorrow off, I'll host a fireside chat with the person, and this is no exaggeration, who is literally the most experienced practitioner of export control policy in the United States. His name is Matthew Borman. He's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration and a 40-year veteran of the Bureau of Industry and Security. I first got to know Matt when I served as Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker's Senior Advisor for Tech Policy during the Obama administration. We'll talk about the Biden administration's China policy, how export controls fit in, and how the administration thinks about what success looks like, among other topics. Today, we'll hear from an industry panel on geopolitics and the semiconductor supply chain, and we'll take a macro look at the interplay between technology competition and great power competition among China, the United States, and its allies. This is a conference about the intersection of technology and geopolitics in a region, East Asia, where much of the innovation and manufacturing for technology is concentrated: China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. It's home to 3 democracies and a revanchist autocracy. It's a place where a 4th democracy, the United States, has vital security, political, and economic interests. Each of these democracies has recently gone through a political transition, or in our case, the United States soon will. A healthy democracy should reflect the will of its citizens. And so, to borrow a phrase from American politics, all geopolitics is at least partially local and sensitive to domestic politics. And so I'm delighted to invite Matt Pottinger to join me on stage, and Colin Kahl via video to kick off our session, the US presidential election and the geopolitics of technology. Matt served in senior roles on President Trump's National Security Council staff as Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 through 2021. He's now a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He also leads the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies China program. Matt spent the late 1990s and early 2000s in China as a reporter for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. He then fought in Iraq and Afghanistan as a U.S. Marine during 3 combat deployments between 2007 and 2010. Colin, joining us via video, is a senior fellow and professor here at Stanford. Colin was going to join us in person, but he had a last-minute change to his schedule. So through the magic of Zoom, we are beaming him in. From April 2021 through July 2023, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the U.S. Department of Defense, basically the number 3 civilian at the Pentagon, essentially the Secretary of Defense's national security advisor. During the Obama administration, Colin served as Deputy Assistant to the President in the Obama administration and National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. Welcome to you both. So to kick us off, I'm going to rewind to the start of the Obama administration. That particular point in time, you can sort of mark the start of a bunch of important digital trends: the popularization of social media, the sort of the start of this explosive growth in smartphone usage, growth in broadband penetration, mainstreaming of cloud usage. There was this unbridled, almost giddy optimism about the transformative potential of technology. So you think about then Secretary of State Clinton's kind of famous speech about the transformative power of social media and color revolutions. There was this kind of supreme confidence in the commanding position of American technology companies. The antagonists in this narrative at the time were the weary giants of flesh and steel. John Perry Barlow's term for the unwoke nation states trying in vain to stop the digital revolution. There was a dark side with cybersecurity, my world at the time, but that was kind of this niche domain that paranoid national security knuckle dragging types like me working in SCIFs worried about. Fast forward today, and that giddiness is certainly gone. It's replaced by a more sober optimism. It's angsty. And I don't think there's any question that China is now the principal antagonist. I think this is a bipartisan view. And so I want to kind of kick us off by maybe turning to Matt and ask kind of what happened.
Yeah, Andrew, good to see you, and Colin as well. Look, what happened was that China had this significant, but in historical terms, brief window when it unleashed a private sector for a handful of decades, and it is now closing that window on the private sector and re-centralizing. But when Beijing got out of the way of its own entrepreneurs, amazing things happened. China built incredible companies, world-beating companies, brilliant entrepreneurs, graduated incredible engineers, and there was overlap also with some state policies that gave a leg up to Chinese national champion companies, long enough for China to gain, often with subsidies and sometimes with stolen intellectual property, but also with real innovative talent, was able to gain massive market share in many of the key technologies that dawned at the turn of the century. And now Beijing has a commanding position in several of these key technologies, and we're now seeing the world starting to get its act together slowly in fits and starts over the last, say, 8 years of pushing back, creating friction for Beijing's mercantilist plans. But it has a commanding position in a lot of key technologies. It's got command of a lot of the discourse power, to use Xi Jinping's phrase. He calls it, discourse war, 言论战, right? TikTok, WeChat, 小红书, little red book. These are things that people would have laughed about, 6, 7, 8 years ago, but are now dominant in globally, apps, which gives Beijing a serious influence over narratives and discourse. So those areas that you talked about, world-beating technology, China's got some of that. It's got more discourse power than anyone would have imagined, and it has the ability to tweak algorithms, regulate algorithms to favor narratives that are anti-liberal, anti-democratic, divisive, and pro-authoritarian. So that's a very short answer to a big question.
Thank you. Colin, anything to add?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think I agree with much of what Matt said. And by the way, it's great to be with everybody. Sorry, I'm remote. I'm in the attic in my back in my house in Washington, D.C. I think what happened is that we were mugged by two realities. The first reality was that the kind of utopian idealism of the techno optimists proved to be false because of the malign use of technologies. So, think about how, there was all this hope around the Arab Spring, and then it turned into an Arab winter. And then ISIS used social media platforms, and violent extremists of other ilks used those platforms. And then propagandists and misinformation and disinformation and Russian meddling in our election, and the way in which the information ecosystem was polluted by the worst forms of kind of nativism and xenophobia. And so just this notion that technology would kind of open us up to kind of a perfect global democracy was mugged by the reality of some pretty dark things that were enabled by the technology. And then the second, and this I think really goes to Matt's point, is that we were all increasingly mugged by geopolitical realities. You had a China that was more assertive in its foreign policy ambitions, in its military activities, in its economic mercantilism, and in its effort, as Matt alluded to really lean into a form of global digital authoritarianism as a way of making a China that was highly interconnected with the world and its information ecosystem, making that information environment safe for the CCP. And so I think we were mugged by those two realities, and the hits keep coming. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has only tightened the collaboration among revisionist authoritarian powers, and that has a very heavy technological overlay. And we're seeing forms of cooperation between Russia and China, Russia and Iran, Russia and North Korea, that is unprecedented, and I think is actually one of the newest and most challenging aspects of the current security environment, and there's a big technological component of that. So we were mugged by reality, and we continue to be mugged by reality.
So there was a period of time, end of the Trump administration, the first maybe year and a half of the Biden administration, where Congress was quite productive in terms of producing a set of tools relevant to this sort of geopolitical technology competition with China, right? So it produced reforms to the export control regime. It produced reforms to the national security review of foreign investment framework. It produced the Chips and Science Act and funding. Are there still areas of consensus that you see between the two camps, where you see potential for continued development and refinement of the toolkit? And where do you see the greatest danger of needs being unmet due to a lack of consensus? Maybe Matt, go to you.
Well, yeah, I would add that the bill that would require ByteDance to divest, a Chinese-controlled company to divest its ownership of TikTok or face a ban in the U.S. market, is a very good example of an overwhelming bipartisan majority that passed that law earlier this year. Where there are other tools and areas where we need to get our act together. And most of these are what I would call defensive measures, which matter, but we can talk about offense, proactive policy to build a larger coalition of countries is a really important piece of this. And you can't really legislate your way to that. That takes executive branch leadership. But on the defensive side, another example that people actually don't know a lot about this rule called the ICTS. It's the Information Communication Technology and Services regime that was first created in an executive order by President Trump, renewed and expanded by President Biden, and only just a few weeks ago implemented for the first time against Chinese technology. What this thing is, ICTS, it's a little bit like if you've heard of CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. The CFIUS is a law, it's a regime chaired by the Treasury Department that can block inbound investment in the United States if there is a threat to national security of that investment. ICTS is the same idea, except it's a Commerce Department chaired body, and it doesn't block investment, it blocks technology, specifically software and IT hardware, from coming into the United States if it comes from a, quote, adversary state, and those states are named. It includes China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and a couple others. But if this technology comes from an adversary state and poses a national security threat, it can be blocked. And so President Biden, his Commerce Department just issued an order that Chinese EV software that allows electric vehicles to connect to the internet and self-drive and do all these things is now banned under this ICTS authority. So what does Congress need to do? Congress needs to pass a law that creates a statutory basis for these executive orders that both Trump and Biden have signed. I think this is one of the most powerful defensive tools that we have in the arsenal that hasn't yet been fully codified or fully used.
Yeah, and just for background, many of these authorities rest on a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is a Cold War era, or really World War II era law that, if you actually read the law, it gives the president a shocking amount of authority to do arguably whatever the hell he or she wants to do, and if he or she declares a national emergency. U.S. export control law actually rested on that authority until Congress passed the export control law I mentioned a few moments ago, back in 2018. So yes, I mean, that would be an area where Congress probably should step in and act to build maybe some boundaries around that authority. But that is an executive action based on a 50-year-old, 60-year-old law. Colin, from your perspective, I mean, are there unmet, areas where, a degree of bipartisan consensus is required, whether legislatively or at least executive action, where there may be a budgetary component where Congress would have to, lend appropriations?
Yeah, so I would just say, whether it's Trump or Harris, whether the Congress is divided or in the hands of one party or the other, I do think there is some room for bipartisan consensus, at least around the objectives and the types of investments that should be made, even if there will be disagreements on exactly how to go and do it and how much of it can be done just through executive and how much requires Congress. But I would just point out a couple of areas of consensus. First, I think there is substantial bipartisan consensus around the notion that China is America's most consequential strategic competitor, what the Defense Department calls our pacing challenge. That is that China is the only country that has the technological, military, economic, and diplomatic heft combined with the intention to try to displace the United States as the world's leading actor. I think there's a lot of consensus around that. And I think there's a lot of consensus that the technological competition is at the heart of that geopolitical competition with Beijing. So that's a good starting point. I think on specific issues, I think there's an understanding that additional investments are going to need to be made in domestic semiconductors if we're going to reduce our dependence on vulnerable supply chains. I think there's a sense that we need to invest in more resilient supply chains in general, not just for semiconductors, but for critical minerals, rare earths, and other things that go into critical technologies. I think there's a bipartisan consensus that we have to make additional investments in our defense industrial base and our modernization efforts to include the more rapid adoption of commercial emerging technologies. I think there's a lot of bipartisan agreement around that. I think there may be an emerging bipartisan agreement on loosening up ITAR restrictions on defense trade. We saw initial movement in this regard as it relates to AUKUS. Most people know AUKUS because of the agreement between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. to build a nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarine. But there's also a second pillar of AUKUS that's really focused on emerging technology cooperation. And to make that work, you really need to break down a lot of the export controls, the licensing requirements that make it difficult for us to export and jointly develop sensitive defense technologies. So I think this is a really good first step because I think there's a growing recognition, given the lessons of Ukraine, that the defense industrial base is increasingly a public good of the free world, and we need to figure out ways to do more with our allies and partners in that regard. I do think, though, there's some major areas of divergence that we're likely to see. One is on what the right approach to AI regulation is. So, for example, you mentioned the National Security Memorandum, which talks a lot about the role of the U.S. AI Safety Institute, which is within NIST, within the Commerce Department. But the AI Safety Institute has very few legal authorities and very few resources. And so I think there will be a big divergence between a Harris administration that probably pushes to get the AI Safety Institute to really be fully enabled and empowered. And, at least if you listen to what Trump has said or what's in the Republican platform, they don't seem to be particularly enthusiastic about, the Biden administration's AI executive order and what it does as it relates to AI safety. I also think there will be debates about the role of export controls on certain the next kind of round of export controls on AI enabling technologies, but also, frankly, the model weights, in particular, the open source model weights. The United States is probably 2 to 3 years ahead of China at the frontier of AI model development. But China can catch up instantaneously the minute that Meta releases the most recent version of its large language models or multimodal frontier models. So I think there's a big debate about, do you regulate the export of model weights and to try to limit diffusion, or do you lean into it under the thesis that diffusion is good for innovation and enabling us to win the long game against China? I just think there's a big debate there. And then lastly, I think there's a big divergence on the other critical technology area, which is the role of the federal government in encouraging the clean energy transition, where obviously, you mentioned the Chips and Sciences Act. You didn't mention the IRA, which was not a bipartisan proposal, but is arguably the biggest technological investment package that the Biden administration engaged in, especially on the clean energy side. We know that we're in the midst of an existential climate crisis, although some people deny that it exists, I guess. But the clean energy transition is going to fundamentally remake our economy, and the role of the federal government in encouraging that or discouraging that, I think, is another area of divergence.
That anything, Dad?
It's good. Yeah.
So maybe let's talk about energy a little bit. I do think that's an area where you do see perhaps one of the sharper, if not the sharpest, difference between the way that the right and the left sort of have approached technology more broadly. And I wonder, how that sort of plays out in some of the so you saw it towards the end of the Trump administration, an effort to promote infrastructure investments in the developing world, to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Biden administration has actually picked up that line of effort, rebranded it and sort of taken it to the G7. And now there's this push through to sort of increase World Bank lending to try to direct more capital to infrastructure investment. And if the idea is to catalyze more investment in say data centers, for example, data centers are energy hungry, and we see in the news a lot more interest in nuclear energy and other renewables. And it seems like figuring out how to get that infrastructure built while at the same time meeting energy requirements is a tough a challenging sort of circle to square. And I just wonder, you know, how what have we seen either of the campaigns talk about this in a strategic way yet? I mean, this is not obviously a big campaign issue, but have we seen traces of this kind of thinking in either of the two campaign orbits? Maybe Matt, I'll start with you.
Well, look, I mean, China's One Belt, One Road initiative is primarily not an economic initiative. It's a strategic initiative for capturing governing elites in poorer countries. So the United States, and you're right, the Biden administration has been looking at this and wrestling with it, and moving the ball forward from where we left off when we were wrestling with this. There are a couple principles to bear in mind to make us more effective in competing against One Belt, One Road. One is that we have to remember that it's actually private investment that is most effective, does the most good in those host countries where it's invested, and is more effective for the countries that are doing the investing in the first place as well. So finding ways to catalyze more private investment is the way to go, right? And people forget Southeast Asia, which has been one of the focuses of China's One Belt, One Road project. Southeast Asia has received far less money from China through its One Belt, One Road project than it has received just from the United States over the course of the last several decades. The stock of our foreign direct investment is much higher, and you don't hear about it because it's not a government initiative. It's private. So you want to find ways to encourage more private investment, and there's a role for government in doing that, including through the IDC, the International Development Finance Corp, and helping with take some of the risk off from investing in places that are risky. But the other is to just take the institutions that we lead, that we help create in the first place, like the World Bank or the Asia Development Bank, and make them more responsive to the needs of those host countries instead of allowing them to be zombified, vessels for Chinese state policies. One really good step we could take would be, for example, to say that the World Bank, what the World Bank does, the U.S. is the biggest contributor. It's always run by an American. It lends money for infrastructure and other projects in the global South and elsewhere. But most of that money, what happens to that money? Right now, 39%, or at least as of a few years ago, I haven't seen the latest figures, but I'll bet it hasn't moved a lot. Those loans, those billions and billions of dollars of loans, are converted into contracts in global South countries to build stuff, dams and railways and you name it. 39% of that money goes to Chinese state-owned enterprises to actually do the contracts. That's foolish on our part. We should have a rule that state-owned enterprises may not participate unless it's in the country or in the region that is receiving the money. In other words, the Chinese state-owned enterprises should not be allowed to bid for World Bank contracts in Uganda. But that's exactly how the program works right now. 39 cents on every dollar that we lend, mostly American money, goes to Chinese state-owned enterprises. Guess what the U.S. number is? How the percentage of World Bank loans that turn into U.S. company projects? It's less than 1%, a lot less than 1%. So that would be the kind of thing you can actually fix the way that some of these institutions that we lead operate, so that they are not zombified vessels for this Communist Party.
What would it take to fix that?
Attention and will. I mean, Congress, actually, the Treasury Department has enormous say over this, but it has been reluctant, for reasons I don't fully understand, to exercise over the course of multiple administrations, to exercise its will. I'll tell you another area. China may not be allowed to direct the World Bank in the director level slot, but it has managed to push in Communist Party officials into very important roles across both the World Bank and other international institutions. Usually, you can see where the CCP installs its officials. It's in the human resources department, so they can bring in more people. It's in the IT department. If you look at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, which is a UN body that the U.S. heavily funds, they brought in as their IT head a Chinese official who immediately replaced all of their IT infrastructure with Huawei, so that they could read all of the the communications of every UN agency that touches the Food and Agriculture Organization. The third area where Beijing's been very effective is the legal department. So they bring in the general counsel. A country that has no rule of law provides the legal officer for many of the UN organizations, and they use that to ensure. In fact, they were able to use that to affect the World Bank to prevent investigations into some of the abuses by Chinese contractors that were receiving World Bank money.
Let's maybe turn a little bit back to
just
yeah. Go ahead.
Can I just say a couple things on the energy question, the energy piece specifically? So
yeah.
Look, I think one of the biggest issues for the next administration, whether it's Trump or Harris, is that all of the leading AI labs and the hyperscalers that they partner with are convinced that the scaling laws associated with frontier AI models will continue. And that means building data centers with not just tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of leading edge GPUs to train the next generation of models. And those will require 500 megawatts, a gigawatt or more of power. I mean, now you're talking about the amount of power that powers a place like Miami. And so the limiting factor on AI development is energy, at least if you believe the leading AI labs and hyperscalers. So I think that's a first year problem for the next administration about how you help private industry maintain the US AI lead by unlocking the energy equation. And I think there will be some things that are likely to be in common, whether it's Trump or Harris. I think there will be an increasing appetite for nuclear power to include small modular reactors. I think there will be a very close look at permitting reform. I think there will be a very close look at how you make investments to improve transmission lines so that our grid has more overall capacity. But I think there will be major divergence on essentially whether you lean into trying to create a virtuous cycle between the energy demands of AI and clean energy, which I suspect would be the Harris approach, or whether you do what Trump calls energy dominance, which is to double down on fossil fuels essentially to power these data centers. I think that's a major potential divergence. The other potential divergence, Andy, goes to your question about how do you think about the types of investments the United States is making around the world. And this is also to Matt's point, and just the views of the global South. I think Matt is absolutely right that this is not about the US government engaging in large amounts of public sector investments. This is actually about unlocking enormous amounts of private capital to compete with China's digital stack around the world. And there it's really about what types of public loans, loan guarantees, risk insurance, and other steps can de-risk investments that otherwise wouldn't be made if market forces were just left up to their druthers. To de-risk those investments and unlock enormous amounts, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of private capital flowing into global South countries. That's like a win-win-win. It enables more distributed benefits of artificial intelligence. It expands American influence. It competes with China's digital authoritarian agenda. It's a win-win-win. There will also be, though, a substantial energy dimension of that, and what types of incentive structures are built in to have that infrastructure done in a sustainable and in a clean energy way. The last point I will make on this is who is the United States going to partner with around the world? And I do think one of the big questions the next administration will have to face is really what is our posture vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have tremendous amounts of money at their disposal through their sovereign wealth funds to fund digital infrastructure and all types of other infrastructure in places like Africa and other dynamic parts of the global South. but they are only likely to do that in partnership with the United States in exchange for certain technological partnerships with us that are going to push the envelope on, especially in the national security bureaucracy, on what types of technology we're willing to share with Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. So that's another major piece of the puzzle next year. Over.
So how do you guys view the first 100 days? I mean, what do you anticipate as being sort of the initial kind of that sort of first set of major kind of muscle movements on technology policy, international affairs in the first 100 days? What are your predictions? What are your based on your observations, what you've seen so far in your past experience?
Yeah. Well, the axis, as I like to call it, I think we are facing an axis now. Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang, which just sent a division of 10,000 troops to go slaughter Europeans on the side of Russia in the war in Ukraine, as well as, of course, Beijing is sort of the key economic power at the heart of this axis. This axis is going to have a big vote in what the agenda of Donald J. Trump or Kamala Harris will be in the first 100 days. I think that this axis is going to pose some common tests, irrespective of who wins the election, and it's also going to have some specially tailored tests for either candidate. I think the test that's going to be tailored by the axis for Trump is going to be around Ukraine, and whether Vladimir Putin can, with the support of Beijing, diplomatic cover and propaganda support and other forms of support, whether it can try to lure President Trump into a diplomatic agreement that heavily favors Russia and Putin's aims, and that's the test that the Trump team, President Trump and his team are going to have to navigate at the outset. With Vice President Harris, if she's elected, I think the test is going to come in the form of possibly in the form of a nuclear agreement dangled by Iran, backed by its partners, to try to lock in Iran as a threshold nuclear power, right within turnkey distance of being able to have an actual nuclear arsenal, and to do that in a way that also leads to sanctions relief and restraint of Israel and so forth. So those might be the two tailored tests for them. The common tests are going to be, of course, everything that Beijing is doing on behalf of its other Axis allies, what it's doing to threaten the Philippines and the South China Sea, and most importantly, what it's doing to threaten Taiwan. You may have noticed or missed that the Chinese Ministry of Defense, in conducting military exercises around Taiwan just a couple of weeks ago, which it said were significantly more significant, significantly more intense than the previous exercises, including the exercises after Speaker Pelosi made her visit in 2022. The Ministry of Defense said there is now a sword hanging over the head of the leadership of Taiwan, and that Beijing will use, in essence, every pretext that it wants to latch on to continually increase pressure over Taiwan, never relenting, never lowering the baseline. So in other words, the pressure only flows, it never ebbs, and that process will continue, according to the Ministry of Defense, until Taiwan has been annexed. So that is going to be on the next president's watch. We are going to see a major and very consequential crisis in the Taiwan Strait.
Colin.
So a couple of things in the first 100 days. First of all, I think, during the transition in the first 100 days, just to the theme of geopolitics and technology, the White House has to get technology right and sorted at the White House. Right now, it's spread across the White House in ways that I think is not conducive to the types of bold and urgent actions that have to be taken. I mean, a lot of times people talk about, whole of government challenges. Right now, there's a whole of White House challenge of like who owns the technology pieces. You have, you know, several parts of the NSC, not even a single belly button at the NSC that runs this. You have elements of industrial policy that touch on the NEC. Obviously, you have the National Cyber Director, which has never been fully empowered, which sits at the White House. You have OSTP at the White House. My guess is, I don't have any inside knowledge on either side. It would surprise me if there is not an assistant to the president for technology or assistant to the president for AI under either President Trump or Harris that tries to herd these cats more effectively and try to get a clearer division of labor on the technology pieces across the executive office of the president. Would be curious to see if what Matt thinks about that. The second thing that related on this, and it ties back to some of the things I've already talked about, is whether an administration in the first 100 days pursues what I might call a compute compact. Right now, the hyperscalers want to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in compute infrastructure. The national security enterprise wants most of those investments to happen in the United States. That can only be done if the government partners with private industry to unlock a lot of the barriers on the regulatory side to get that done. That is something the government will have to take a hard look at very early on, but also gives the government leverage to ask some things from private industry in return, not the least of which would be some access to that compute infrastructure for the purposes of evaluating models as they get trained, evaluating their safety before they're released, and getting some access to compute infrastructure for national security purposes, which the US government doesn't have nearly enough of. This is a window of opportunity for the next administration that I hope that they would pursue early on. And then just to a bunch of the points that Matt made, the president's going to have to submit their first budget. And that's going to have some really big questions on the technology side, a lot of the investments we've been talking about already, but also just what does the defense budget look like in the context of this kind of axis of upheaval that Matt is talking about. I prefer the term Legion of Doom to axis of upheaval, but the point is the same one that Matt's been making, which is that our rivals and adversaries are increasingly tightening their alignment with one another in ways that are qualitatively different. And as they level up their team, we have to level up our team as well. And that'll include significant defense investments. But also it will include big questions on the Ukraine security assistance issues that Matt put on the table. I agree that the next administration in the first 100 days is going to have to try to land the plane in the Middle East. That includes moving from a ceasefire to a more enduring end, if we get a ceasefire, to get a ceasefire and then move to a more enduring end to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. I think the Iranian nuclear issue will come back with a vengeance, if for no other reason, because with the decapitation and disruption and degradation of Hezbollah, which is Iran's forward deterrent capability against Israel, Iran has a compelling argument for weaponizing their threshold nuclear capability. That's the bad news. The good news is with the weakening of the axis of resistance in the Middle East, there's a lot of leverage on Iran right now. And so I think either administration will have an opportunity to pursue a diplomatic path. And then the question is, can you get a Goldilocks outcome of something that is maximally possible, but not so maximalist that's impossible, which is my view of what the Trump administration pursued on Iran before, or perhaps not sufficiently ambitious, which was the critique of the Obama era nuclear deal. It probably has to be somewhere in between those two. And then lastly, I don't know whether there's going to be a Taiwan Strait crisis in the first 100 days. There may be actually more pushing in the South China Sea because, and I would think especially if Trump is in the White House, because I'm just not sure his heart is in going to war to defend the Philippines in the South China Sea. So, you might see Beijing pushing there. But they could dial up the heat in an effort to put pressure on the next administration. But running counter to that might be some incentive to have a honeymoon period or an olive branch to see whether they can turn down the temperature with the new administration as opposed to riling it up right at the outset. So I'm not quite as convinced that there will inevitably be a U.S.-China crisis right out of the gate, but certainly something to watch. Over.
Yeah, and my view is that it will be during the next term, not necessarily the next 100 days of the first term. Yeah, crisis.
Do we think there will be a round of new tariffs, export technology-related tariffs or export controls on China?
Yeah, I think. Look, President Trump's been pretty vocal about the fact that he intends to put significant tariffs on China, well above the tariffs that he imposed starting in 2018, and which President Biden added to recently, at least in the EV space, right? President Biden quadrupled, essentially, U.S. tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. President Trump has the authority to do that. In fact, it's the same authority that he used and that President Biden used to put those tariffs on in the first place. Section 301 of the Trade Act from the 1970s. That authority is still alive in the form of those previous actions. So it won't take much process for a new Trump administration to impose significant tariffs on China. Now, President Trump has also talked about how he wants to put tariffs on everyone else as well. That is not something that he can do through executive fiat. I think there are legal theories that his team's looking at and how to impose a broad gauge tariff on the world. But I think that they're going to have a hard time defending actions like that in court unless they've got Congress behind them passing laws. I don't know where a Harris administration would go with respect to tariffs and trade policy, to be honest.
I don't have particular inside information, but I think it's, given that Harris has been pretty critical of what she has described, at least on the campaign trail, as Trump's sales tax, which is essentially by increasing the cost of imports via tariffs. I think we can fairly safely say she's not going to do what he is saying he's going to do. Yeah. And almost assuredly, she would not do it against both China and our allies at the same time. I think the view on the Democratic side was that whatever one thought of Trump's tariffs, the fact that he picked fights with both China and our allies at the same time in the previous administration was counterproductive. That we are in a stronger position to either negotiate or adapt around trade with China if we have our allies at our side. But if we're picking fights with them as we're picking fights with Beijing, it's counterproductive geopolitically. On the export controls issue, I think I would expect to see a continuation of what we've seen now, which is a bit of whack-a-mole on Chinese efforts to circumvent the export controls on leading edge chips, continued pressure on Japan and the Netherlands to crack down on the provision of chip making tools, but especially the maintenance and spare parts of the machines that are already in China. I think you can expect to see that. And then I think you will expect to see a push to see how much executive authority there is to apply export controls on model weights for frontier AI models, given the challenge from open source models coming out of places like Meta. And if you can't do that through executive action, can you work with Congress to deal with it? I would expect that there would be a focus on that. Over.
Well, we've got a few minutes. Do you guys mind taking some questions? Questions? Yeah, let's open it up to questions. I think we've got time for maybe 2 or 3 questions from the audience. So if you have a question, throw your hand up and I will call on you. Any questions? Oh, come on, don't be shy, people. You know you've got questions.
There's one number.
Oh yeah, great. Go ahead. Kyo, please.
Hi, thank you both for the terrific discussion. I'm Kyo Tutsuya at Stanford. Last comment touched on this point a little bit, but you spent a lot of time talking about the axis or the region of
doom.
Region of doom. And I'm wondering, on the other side, U.S. has allies especially technologically strong allies like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the new U.S. president, the administration could do to consolidate support, enhance the alliance, or at least in the case of Trump 2.0, at least not to alienate them. What can they do about that?
Yeah. Well, look, we've talked a lot about sort of defensive steps. Tariffs are a defensive kind of measure. If President Trump is elected, what I'm hoping he puts his trade team to work at doing is not trying to do some kind of a deal with China that takes 3 years to negotiate and is never going to be honored in Beijing anyway, but to put that effort into trying to build a coalition of friends, rule of law societies, countries that aspire to be rule of law societies, to trade more freely with one another. And that is going to take a lot of creative work and a lot of focus, and we'll see, right? But I do think that there are standards that need to be set between the United States and Japan and Korea and Europe and others for EVs, for example, right? So that rather than the United States being the odd man out that has its own standards and is hiding behind high tariffs, and by the way, I think the tariffs are a good idea for against China, but rather than becoming an isolated market, we make it so that China is the isolated market with its own odd standards, while the standards between Japan and South Korea, Europe, the United States, and others are common to one another, so that you have greater efficiency. You don't have to have companies reinventing software for each market. Only China would have to be in the uncomfortable position of having to duplicate everything it does. So that's going to take a lot of work. Colin's right that all these very thorny, complicated economic and technology issues are going to really determine over the next 4 years whether we become, in Henry Kissinger's old world, an island off the coast of the world, or whether we remain really the leading technological and economic power in the world.
Couple things, Kyo. That's a great question. Look, I think the next administration has to do a bunch of things with our closest allies. If the other side is leveling up, we have to level up. I think that on the defense side, that means easing defense trade and lowering export controls on sensitive technologies with close treaty allies, following the example of the ITAR reforms under AUKUS. I think it means sharing more information with our allies. That will require them to protect that information better than they currently do. But that's something that we need to be doing. I think there's a lot of opportunity to build on the progress of the Biden administration on building more resilient supply chains across our allies and partners for all of the critical inputs that go into our leading edge technologies. I think thinking creatively about friendshoring, not just onshoring, that's politically difficult sometimes, but we need to do so. I agree with Matt that it'd be good for us to think more holistically about how to synchronize, regulation, tax structures, border adjustments, and other things with our allies, so that we have more of a united front as it relates to Beijing. That'll be really tricky to do. But we need to get after it. I think the other piece, though, Kyo, is not just like making sure our team levels up, but growing the team. That is building a broader coalition around issues. And I think especially for very dynamic parts of the global South, swing states. We've already mentioned Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but there are other, very important swing states: Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, countries like that. I mean, just as one example, there will be more people in Nigeria on current trends at the end of the 21st century than there will be in China. 800 million Nigerians to 700 million Chinese. So shame on us if we don't have a value proposition to Nigeria. And that's just one example. So there has to be a big play for the global South in the next administration. The last point I will make, though, is more just a philosophical one, and that is, I don't think this is a partisan point, but Trump and Harris just have fundamentally different views of alliances. Not that they don't want to work with allies, but they just have different philosophies. I think Trump, at the end of the day, believes that our alliances are rooted in interests. Harris believes they're interest plus values. Trump looks at our alliances basically transactionally and largely through an economic lens. I think Harris sees our alliances, our treaty alliances, as having intrinsic value and looks through them mostly through a security lens. I think that Trump tends to see alliances bilaterally, kind of hub and spoke. Harris tends to view them multilaterally, more like a lattice work or a spider web. And Trump views alliances through hyper-personalistic relationships. And I think Harris sees them as more institutionalized and routinized. You can make your own judgments about which approach you think is better. I'll leave that to you. But certainly one is I think, more likely to create a kind of spirit and habit of collaboration than the other.
Well, I think with that, we are actually at time. Sorry, Larry. We are at time. I need to turn it over to our next panel on technology and great power competition views from the region. So with that, please join me in thanking Matt and Colin.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Andy, Kyo, and everyone on the Stanford team for organizing this amazing event. The first panel obviously did not disappoint, and it actually also teed us up to what we will be talking about. One of them, of course, will be this issue of tech alliance. And we spent the last hour talking about the geopolitics of technology and how the United States got here and how the United States is going to move forward. Over the next hour, we're going to take the view from the region, but let's just kind of, the common understanding is this, that the United States is committed to remaining competitive and resilient in the advanced technology sphere. And in order to remain an advanced technology and in a nation of innovation, it needs to do a number of things, including be a leader in establishing the rules and norms of advanced technology, including AI. But to do so, I believe there are two things that are needed. One is that the United States cannot do this alone, and that in order to come up with the production, the distribution, the infrastructure, and the like, to ensure that the United States remains this advanced technology competitor, it can only do so in alignment with its partners, especially in Northeast Asia. And the key partners in the region are, of course, as mentioned previously, are Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And they too share many of Washington's concerns, but they also have their own interests and their own needs as well. And so I hope that over the next hour, we can talk about what does managed competition amongst friends and allies actually look like, and what can like-minded governments do to ensure that they reach some of their shared interests when it comes to achieving the goals of technology competitions. And I also want to focus on the geostrategic implications of what it means for Northeast Asia's middle powers in achieving their own technology ambitions as well. So we have a great lineup of speakers. They really don't need any introduction, but if I may very briefly, in the order that I would like them to speak, first up will be Mireya Solís, who is the director of the Center for Asia Policy Studies at Brookings, and she is also the Philip Knight Chair in Japan Studies at Brookings. She's also the author of Japan's Quiet Leadership, Reshaping the Indo-Pacific. Following her will be Victor Cha, who is president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and also the Korea chair at CSIS. Victor is also the distinguished university professor at Georgetown University, of which there are only 5? Yeah, something like that. Very few, very few. He's also a author of many books, most recently, Korea, A New History of South and North Korea. And then finally, I'm excited to have Jeremy Chang join us. He is the CEO and Research Fellow at the Research Institute for Democracy, Society, and Emerging Technologies, which is under Taiwan's National Science and Technology Council. So with that, maybe I could turn to you now, Mireya, to talk about Japan. And of course, when we are in Washington, we hear a great deal about Japan and its proactive engagement in developing an economic security legislation. I'm hoping you can talk briefly about how that fits into Japan's broader goal of ensuring its technology competitiveness.
Thank you very much, Shihoko, for teeing up the discussion. Thank you, Andrew, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I have to say it's the first time I come to Stanford. I haven't yet looked around campus, but I'm looking forward very much to doing that and then having this productive conversation first. So let me talk a little bit about Japan's approach to economic security and how it ties into its broader technological ambitions. And I would start by saying that Japan has embraced with gusto the economic security agenda. And it is not taking a very narrow definition as to what falls in the bucket of economic security or not. In fact, it's actually growing very rapidly. It's touching many, many different areas. It is providing a new rationale for government intervention, both in the regulation and promotion side. I think it's also leading to some redefinition of government-business relations in Japan with a lot of coordination and consultation between business and bureaucracies. And it has also been deeply integrated into Japan's national security strategy and informs very much what Japan is doing in terms of its diplomacy on many different fronts. So economic security, for instance, has become a pillar, a regular pillar now of the US-Japan conversation, but also very much guides Japan's interactions with Taiwan, and there are trilateral efforts with the United States, Japan, and South Korea. Now, one thing that Japan has done that facilitates things for me when I try to explain what this is all about is that it has come up with two nifty concepts that I think are very good to illustrate what this is all about. And the idea here is that when Japan thinks about economic security, it has two main objectives: strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability. So what are these concepts about? Well, with strategic autonomy, I think it's easy to understand that this is about taking a hard look and identifying where are there areas of vulnerability, serious dependencies that could be used by others to cause havoc, disruption in the operation of Japan's society, economy, government, unity. And the idea is to begin to correct for those overdependencies and vulnerabilities. And then when you think about the strategic indispensability, the idea is that Japan wants the world to need Japan, and do so because of Japan trying to build niches of technological prowess, where folks have to look at Japan for them to acquire the specific technologies, advanced components, production equipment, you name it. And I think that these concepts are interesting because we can use them to then use them as a mirror and look at what Japan is doing. And then people give a sense of how much defense and offense are going to play into Japan's economic security. And another characteristic of Japan, Shihoko, is that this will not come as a surprise to you. Japan likes institutionalization. So they have taken this and rolled their sleeves. And I think that Japan is probably one of the few countries that has a standalone economic security legislation, which was enacted in 2022. And if you look at that piece of legislation, going to your question, Shihoko, I think clearly that the balance of effort is on the defensive side, not on the offensive, not in leaping forward. Why I say this? Because three of the pillars of this Economic Security Act have to do with addressing vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, vulnerabilities in trying to protect very sensitive patents, and vulnerabilities in terms of identifying critical products where there could be a single source suppliers, and that could create a choke point, and therefore it's important for the government to try to encourage diversification. And the idea is that now the government wants to have an understanding of how these supply chains are mapped out. And there's another pillar that does address the question of the strategic indispensability. And the idea here is that there's going to be a new effort for government business cooperation on frontier technologies, in particular semiconductors. Now, it's interesting, I think, because now that we have come to an era where the industrial policy has become mainstream, I think that when it comes to Japan and the METI bureaucrats, the industrial bureaucrats, this is really about pushing on an open door. This is something that goes to a long-standing tradition in Japan that was not as active for a while. But I think that there's an idea that the industrial policy is coming back, and METI has rolled out the semiconductor industry, referring to it as a national project. And some hefty subsidies have been awarded, something in the neighborhood of $25.7 billion in the range of 3 to 5 years are going to be dispersed. Now, where you put your money tells you about the priorities, and it's also clear what Japan is doing here. Some of that money is going to go to facilitate research and development, but this is not going to be done just by Japanese companies. Now you have Samsung coming to Japan on an R&D center, but also TSMC. And there's also, I think, very interesting that what the government is trying to do is to look at what areas of the semiconductor ecosystem are weak and therefore they need support. Because Japanese companies, when it comes to advanced materials and production equipment, are actually in many cases world market leaders. So, but where Japan does not have a lot of strength is in the fab business, in manufacturing inside Japan, those chips. And again, the priorities are very clear. Most of the subsidies have for advancing that kind of manufacturing have gone to two ventures, which are of very different nature. One is bringing TSMC, the Taiwanese most competitive semiconductor firm, to Japan to produce largely legacy chips. And that venture has actually gone very, very well. And the other one, and this is a very interesting one, is the Rapidus initiative, where the idea is that you want to leapfrog the technology and for Japan to be able to produce the most competitive chips in 2 nanometers in Hokkaido, where you don't have an established ecosystem for semiconductor manufacturing, and to do that in a number of years. This is done through a consortium of Japanese companies bringing technology from IBM, but a lot of the money, the vast majority of the money comes from the government, not from the private sector. So to wrap up, Shihoko, I think that it's very clear from what I've been saying is a couple of things. Japan wants to correct for vulnerabilities, but actually when you look at the dependence on China for rare earth minerals, actually that dependence has gone up. So it's difficult. These interdependencies are stubborn. When it comes to strategic indispensability, it is clear that Japan cannot orchestrate a semiconductor renaissance on its own. It relies on business alliances. It's not the old industrial of the past where Japan kept multinationals at bay. And I would say that we don't know if this bold bet to provide for leapfrogging in the Rapidus venture is going to play out. The jury is still out, and we don't know if this is going to work out going forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mireya, for that really great overview. And I hope that I can actually get back to you to talk about what Rapidus actually means in terms of Japan's own bigger, broader technology ambitions and aspirations. But before I do that, if I can turn to you, Victor, to talk about Korea, and specifically Korea too has come up with an economic security legislation. It focuses on supply chain resiliency. And that also includes in part a focus on economic coercion both against China, but also Japan and other countries as well. So hoping you could kind of set the scene on what is Korea's vision in all of this.
Sure, thank you. And it's, I didn't know this is your first time to Stanford. That's great. Yeah. It's great to be back. This place is like a second home for me. I don't know how many postdocs here. I think every possible institute, CSAC, Hoover, APARC, FSI, like the list goes on and on. So
I'm taking notes.
Yeah. So it's really good to be here. So the way I'm going to approach this question is I'm going to borrow from a framework that my colleague Jim Lewis has used at CSIS to think about, like, what are the prerequisites for how we think about the idea of technology alliances, right? I mean, especially with Japan and Korea, of course, we have bilateral mutual defense treaties between the two, but these alliances have grown in all sorts of scope and depth over the recent decade. And the whole question is, in this area of technology and economic security, what are the prerequisites to think about some sort of technology alliance? Parallel discussion could take place with regard to Europe. And so the first place to start at the very basic level is to think about whether countries look at this issue of technology and economics, technology competition, great power competition, and economic security through very basically a self-help or a mutual help lens. And so I think here it's pretty safe to say that most U.S. partners think about it as mutual help. They don't really think about it as self-help. They don't have the capabilities to think about it as self-help. So that is one. The other is whether an alliance of this sort would have common objectives, right? And so what could these common objectives be? On the one hand, they could be the objective of U.S. Technological dominance, which is certainly something that the U.S. would see as would resonate with the United States. For Asian allies, there might be, under certain conditions, there might be a willingness to see this as one of the objectives, maybe less so for Europe, because there's a different history with regard to technology in Europe. Would the common objective be clearly focused on China, which, in a sense, it already is? I think depending on what China does going forward, that is certainly another area where there could be common objectives. And then broadly, this common objective of technological sovereignty, which could mean certainly for countries like Japan and Korea, and as well as for Taiwan, independence from China. But the question is, does that also mean independence from the United States? And so again, I think it would be different whether you're talking to Asian partners and European partners with regard to that. The second set of issues would be how to think about the creation of these sorts of, what would be sort of the basis or the architecture for creating these sort of technology alliances? Would it be something that would start from scratch, like you'd have to create them from the beginning, or is it something where you can take existing architecture and try to mold it or bend it or expand it in a way that would allow you to have a good basis for performing these technological alliances? Not related to technology, but in general terms, this is an area that I have done some work in, looking at sort of the failures and the underperformance of some of our traditional institutions of global governance, like the UN Security Council, which for all intents and purposes is completely frozen from doing anything today. Apropos the previous conversation about what we could see in the first 100 days of a Biden or a Harris or a Trump administration, you can be pretty certain that the UN Security Council will not play much of a role in any of that. In the last 5 years, Russia has vetoed something like 14 draft UN Security Council resolutions, and China has aided and abetted at least 5 of those, right? So that just gives you a sense of where the UN is. The other possibility is G20, but that's way too big. It had great expectations at the time of the financial crisis, but now I think it's way too large, and it's also stymied by geopolitical rivalries. Putin just hosted a summit of the BRICS Plus, the new BRICS Plus in Russia. That doesn't seem like an organization that would be conducive to building technological alliances. And of course, we have other groupings like the Quad and AUKUS, but those in many ways are too narrow. too narrow a focus to think about the building of these technological alliances. So one area that that I've focused on and shown a lot of interest in, both from a security global governance perspective, but also from a technology alliance perspective, is the role of an expanded G7. Right, G7 countries plus the traditional G7 countries plus Australia plus South Korea. If we're talking about technology, plus the Netherlands, plus Taiwan. These seem like the most appropriate groupings to think about building these sorts of technology alliances. And then on Korea, specifically with regard to Korea, they're clearly a couple of steps behind Japan in terms of the way they're thinking about these. Japan was in many ways out front, leading in terms of both thinking about economic security and then thinking about it in terms of domestic legislation, friendshoring, reshoring, these sorts of things. But I think Koreans have really adopted this as part of their overall national security outlook going forward. The primary point of entry was, of course, through the alliance with the United States, where we have seen a broadening and a deepening of the alliance relationship over the past half decade to fully include economic security and supply chain resilience as part of this comprehensive alliance framework. I personally think that this is a very good thing for Korea, because this issue more than anything else is a spur to Korea's participation in more of the plurilateral and minilateral dialogues that are taking place throughout the Indo-Pacific. There was a period of time where we had a graphic that we developed that showed all of the cooperation that was taking place among this, and we came out with this during the Trump administration, all of the democracy-based initiatives that were taking place in the Indo-Pacific. Some of them were related, so this was during Trump, so it was like the Blue Dot Network, the Clean Network. There were a variety of different things. And what was astounding about this picture was you had all these lines connecting, like India, the United States, Australia, Japan, and Korea kind of sat in the middle, and there were no lines connecting Korea to any of these things, and Taiwan included. And there were no lines connecting Korea to any of these things, or very, very faint lines. That picture today, I actually showed a version of this picture today, so from what the picture looks like today to folks in the current administration at a recent dinner. And it's like technical, it's like multicolored, like Korea has been sort of pulled in because of supply chain resilience, economic security issues into these sorts of things. Obviously the Chip 4 alliance, the Mineral Security Partnership, the Camp David Trilateral, economic security dialogues, all these sorts of things. And so at least from my perspective for Korea, this is both good for Korea, but it's also from an economic security perspective, but it's also good for Korea in terms of embedding themselves much more in sort of this architecture in Asia. As you said, Shihoko, but I think one of the big vulnerabilities for Korea going forward, and there may be specific ones we can talk about related to companies or legacy, but to me, like the bigger strategic vulnerability going forward is the constant preoccupation and concern with economic retaliation and economic coercion from China. This is, this was obviously very, very clear to Korea in 2016, 2017, over an issue that had really nothing to do with economic security. It had to do with military security, which was the emplacement of a US missile defense system in Korea, to which China responded with massive economic coercion. But that has cast a shadow over almost every decision that Korea makes on economic security issues and technology cooperation. So I think part and parcel of this idea of building technology alliances is to figure out a way to create some sort of deterrence of Chinese economic coercion. This is not just in the technology field. This is, more broadly speaking, how to create ways not just to defend against Chinese economic coercion, which is, of course, things that we're already doing today, like impact mitigation, trade diversification, supply chain resilience, reshoring, friendshoring, but also trying to come up with some sort of collective economic deterrence strategy to deter in advance Chinese economic coercion. Here, the Europeans, I think, are further along than the United States, Japan, and Korea, and Australia for that matter, in the sense that Lithuania, the Chinese actions against Lithuania were a real wake-up call for Europe. And as we know, they've created the anti-coercion instrument. It has not been used yet, which is, in a sense, a good sign, because it may show that there's actually deterrent effect that's being signaled. But to me, that is one of the pieces of getting Korea to be more cooperative, more willing to go along with these efforts at technology alliances. And then finally, and I think this goes without saying for Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, it's not just about participating once the rules are made, but it's about being part of the rulemaking itself. I think everybody kind of agrees that, based on the initial experience with things like the IRA, that while it was new and everybody was feeling their way, it was a very inefficient way to do things, because there was a lot of going back and trying to address concerns from key allies. So finding a way to create greater rulemaking capabilities or avenues for rulemaking, I think, is another important prerequisite for building these technology alliances.
Great. Thank you, Victor. You've laid a lot on the table there. But one of the things that I hope we can discuss further is this, the challenges of a tech alliance. And you mentioned Chip 4, which brings me to Jeremy. Of course, for Taiwan, economic security is defined, is like, for its survival, it's absolutely necessary. And there is no question about the role that Taiwan plays, not only geostrategically in an incredibly volatile region, but also for the economic health of the global economy as well. But at the same time, one of the challenges, of course, is to ensure safeguarding the Taiwanese semiconductor industry. And I hope you can highlight some of the ways that Taiwan will be able to build on its success as the behemoth of the semiconductor industry, and to how it can replicate the success of TSMC into beyond that company and beyond the semiconductor industry as well.
Well, thanks so much, Shihoko, and thanks so much, Andrew, for inviting us. It's really our privilege to be participate here in Stanford, and also be speak in front of you. So I'm Jeremy Chang. I'm from Taiwan. I'm a CEO of DSET, which is a newborn research think tank under the affiliation for Taiwan's National Science and Technology Council. We've been conducting research and providing policy solutions for Taiwanese government in terms of a technology policy that related to the era of techno-geopolitics. Of course, when we mention about the era of techno-geopolitics, the biggest issue for Taiwan is especially our semiconductor industry. So let's just trace back to the history. Why Taiwan has a semiconductor industry? Why Taiwan has the irreplaceable and indispensable semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem now? It's really honestly to say, for most of the Taiwanese people, it's kind of a coincidence, because we started the industry in the middle of the last century, just as a simple idea to embrace a business model called OEM business model, because during that time, Taiwan has just been industrialized. We didn't have many buying power. So with the business model, we just take the order from the clients from the United States and Japan, and we manufacture the electronic components for the clients. And then we bought, because of the Morris Chang, the founder of the TSMC, he invented the business model, so-called foundry. So we fabricate the semiconductor chips for the clients. So the business model is like the same. We don't do designing, we don't do branding, we don't have a marketing, we just do manufacturing. So this is kind of simple. However, after the decades in development, especially during the era of globalization, Taiwan has become one of the most critical part of the supply chain. Now, the TSMC, or all of you guys have already known that the TSMC's capacity of manufacturing the most advanced semiconductor logic chip is kind of already achieved a kind of a dominant status. Intel, Samsung, of their competitors have been already left behind. But for Taiwan, it's really a uncommon experience, because we haven't been really thought about like one day that Taiwan will be dominated about the semiconductor industry. And we didn't imagine that, you know, after the escalation of the US-China competition on the, pursuing the hegemonic position in terms of the most advanced technologies, especially during the AI era. And the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing has become one of the most critical strategic technology product for the world and for the allies. So it's really an uncommon experience. And we still have to figure out where Taiwan can do, what can Taiwan can play, where Taiwan can leverage our semiconductor supply chain to enhance the relationships with the ally countries. Those are the questions that we haven't been discussed previously, but we have to, in the sudden, we have to discuss everything that we are not familiar with previously. So for me, currently, I think for Taiwan, in the geopolitical context, that we have been facing the challenges from both sides. First of all, of course, we have been facing the challenges from China, because China is always the most potential ecosystem that replaces Taiwan's role. We have already experienced for many industries that developed in Taiwan, however, have been replaced by China. Panel industry, so maybe Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the same. Our panel industry has already been replaced by China. And once the part of the industry has been replaced by China, it's eternally gone. So we cannot take that back. Now we don't have a LED, we don't have a LCD, we don't have a OLED. That's already all monopolized by the Chinese competitor. On the other hand, we kind of perform still good in terms of the most of the advanced process of semiconductor chip manufacturing, just because it's super complex. You got that, hundreds of a process. So it's not very easy for your competitor to replace you in the short term. So that might be the strength for Taiwan. And also Taiwan, because our ecosystem has been keeping the position of the efficiency. So we have the efficiency, the cost efficiency, the sustainability. So once Taiwan can manufacture the semiconductor chips there on this island nation, we still have the strength to protect our position in terms of the global supply chain. However, China has been targeting us for decades. They have been using the economic coercion, as Shihoko and Victor, you mentioned, economic coercion. We have experienced almost, maybe not every month, but maybe every season, especially for the past 8 years. So that's kind of a common, that's kind of a common for Taiwan. Well, on the other hand, China has been using, IP theft, technology transfer, lots of, ways. They just access to Taiwan's engineers. They recruit Taiwan's engineers physically or they recruit the Taiwan's engineers remotely, or in order to copy Taiwan's business model, or in order to copy Taiwan inside of the technology management to the R&D to their side. So this is the really normal types of us. So we have been trying to upgrade our economic security regulatory regime, trying to safeguard the technology, but not only for us, but for the democracies, for the allied countries. This is the effort that we have been trying to accomplish for the past couple of years. On the other hand, another challenges that we are facing now might be potentially from the like-minded countries. Especially all of you have already known that after the year of 2018 to 2019, 2020, we experienced about not only the US-China competition, but also the pandemic, the shortage of the semiconductor chips. So suddenly, every allied countries has started to embrace the so-called industrial policy, which previously is not really common, because, based on the rationale of the economic rationale, United States have been giving up for the industrial policy for decades. Japan maybe as well. Well, Japan is kind of in the middle. But again, it's really a common that suddenly everybody started to think that the semiconductor manufacturing is the most critical technology, and everybody should have that technology domestically. So we've seen Chips and Science Act there in the United States. We have seen Japan has its industrial policy starting to subsidize the semiconductors. So TSMC goes to Japan for investment, and European countries as well. So this is kind of a new challenge for Taiwan, and we're facing the challenge that whether Taiwan still can maintain our market share, whether Taiwan still can maintain the efficiency of the ecosystem here in Taiwan to manufacturing the most efficient, the most reliable, and the most sustainable manufacturing sector for the semiconductor chips. So these will be two challenges, both not only from our adversary, but also maybe potentially from our like-minded countries. So what do we do? It's a really good question. So we have been keeping discussing about these matters inside the governmental policy-making circle, but you barely see Taiwan has an official voice. When everybody else is asking whether Taiwan is happy about the TSMC investing in Arizona, whether Taiwan is optimistic about the TSMC is going to Dresden in Germany, whether Taiwan, how Taiwan see that TSMC is investing in Japan. Mm-hmm. So this is quite a good question. So everybody has been asking for any Taiwanese people. I mean, I have a Taiwanese face, so how do you think about that? I say, well, we got, of course, we got pros and cons, right? Of course, we have a concern that our market share has been replaced by our allies. On the other hand, we see that's a new chance for Taiwan because Taiwan has been always be isolated from any international mechanism, from the UN, so the G7, all the others, and so the multilateral region. We have just been excluded from that. We don't have a voice. We don't have a seat there. And whether the participation or the strengthened collaboration between Taiwan, United States, Taiwan, Japan, Taiwan in Germany, Taiwan, European countries can bring the chance for Taiwan that Taiwan be included as a new member for shaping the future of our technology and the future of human beings, I mean, for the democracies. This is a really good question. But in the past couple of years, we barely see this initiative has included Taiwan. Maybe only Victor has mentioned about the Chip 4 Alliance, or maybe a bilateral initiative for the US-Taiwan 21st Century Trade Initiative. That might be only two of that. But we have seen many new events that happened around the world. We've seen the G7 has an economic security framework initiative. We have seen IPEF that led by the United States. We have seen the US, Japan, Korea trilateral economic security framework that just emerged last year and this year. There are many progresses, but for Taiwan, we have an anxiety that why Taiwan has just always been excluded from our friends. This is kind of doubtful. Well, previously, of course, because recognized Taiwan as a national state, recognizing Taiwan as a partner for participating in the international organization is kind of a risky. For the Department of State, it's risky. For the MOFA Japan, MOFA Korea, it's risky. However, our current goal, our ultimate goal for now is that the democracies still have to dominate the most advanced technologies. And now Taiwan is a irreplaceable, indispensable partners. But if we are still like worrying about whether including Taiwan will provoke China, and so keep Taiwan still out of the negotiation table, whether we can achieve our ultimate goal. This is kind of a question for all of the Taiwanese people. So this might be a challenge for Taiwan as well. But again, so we're really looking forward to that will bring a new chance to deepen the interdependence among Taiwan and United States, Japan, Korea, European countries. Once our technologies can have more collaboration together, exchanging more human talents together. That's always for the good for the democracies. So we're looking forward to have more and more friendshoring, more and more collaboration. It's not only about the manufacturing part. It's about the exchange. It's about the R&D. It's about the future of the most advanced technologies. So we should do that together. So don't ignore Taiwan. Inclusion of Taiwan. It's the future of the democracies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for your enthusiasm and optimism as well. Our panel discussion is about great power competition. We've spoken a lot about the China challenge, but let me turn to the other part of that competition, which is to say the United States. The United States sees the China challenge in a certain way. It has taken a number of very specific measures. I'm thinking in particular about export control of chip manufacturing capabilities. And I'm also thinking about industrial policies that the United States has embraced. We've talked about this in the previous session about the IRA and the CHIPS Act. My question to you is this. How do the governments of Japan, Taiwan, and Korea, to what extent is there like an alignment in what the United States sees as this, like how it sees the great power competition, and where are the divergences, and where do we see this like actually leading to some friction? So Mireya.
First, thank you very much, Shihoko. Let me be brief. I would say that there's broad strategic alignment. Japan has been skeptical of China for a while now. I think that Japan was the first country that directly experienced economic coercion in 2010. I think Japan has had bitter experiences in terms of China aggressively, pushing for territorial claims in the East China Sea. And this has already persuaded Tokyo that a more powerful China presents a significant challenge. And in the latest national security strategy of Japan, China is identified as the biggest challenge. At the same time, Tokyo is trying to balance different equities in its relationship with China. And in that same strategic document talks about the desire to maintain constructive and productive ties. Now, when it comes to the technological competition dimension that is the focus this afternoon, I would say that, again, as I was portraying what Japan is doing in economic security, it's clear that Japan wants to protect its crown jewels. Japan wants to coordinate closely with the United States. The technology dialogue has become central to the US-Japan alliance, but there are significant gaps that have not yet been resolved. I would say that from the eyes of Tokyo, the United States is saying that it has now coalesced around the notion of de-risking. And that sort of, it's like comfort food. We feel therefore that this is going to be a very targeted, focused, restrained approach. But I think that Tokyo still watches what is happening in Washington, and it's not so sure. It feels perhaps that the debate whether it will be de-risking or decoupling is not yet fully settled. And there are different reasons for that. One is, let's talk about export controls, which have been front and center in this discussion. When you hear what the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been saying about what is the target of these efforts, he's talking about, in his words, force multiplier technologies. These are technologies that are going to be critical to economic competitiveness and military modernization. So by definition, we're talking about broad families of technologies that affect everything. So clearly, this is not just about a small yard. It's going to be quite large. Secondly, now the United States has advocated a different theory of the case of how you compete with China, what are the ultimate goals. And the notion is that because of Chinese military fusion practices, it cannot just be about staying ahead, but actually slowing down Chinese technological development. I have yet to encounter a government in the region that openly endorses that, the slowing down of Chinese technological development. They don't want to go there. And lastly, I think that it's, of course, the concern with retaliation from China looms large. And Japan, when they went along and tightened controls over these 23 semiconductor production equipment categories, when they negotiated with the United States, China retaliated by, sending a signal that it could close the faucet on germanium and gallium and other very important critical minerals that Japan relies on very heavily. But the concern is also, again, as to whether the yard is not going to get very large and whether Japan, legacy chips or other technologies might now also be restrained. So this is, there's not one, we have not yet reached that final point of an equilibrium. This is going to continuously shift. And I think that that's a critical difference between Japan and the United States. I end up with one other point. And I think that there's more commonality here with the East Asian players here. Japan wants to, of course, as I said, embrace economic security, but is trying to also not undermine the multilateral trading system as it does so. And this results in some balancing acts, therefore, in how it thinks about restrictions, technology restrictions or FDI screening, or how you address Chinese economic overcapacity. Or how you implement subsidies that are not blatantly in violation of the WTO. I don't think that restraint is here in the United States. And whether the United States has the patience to understand why Japan is trying to find ways in which it reconciles these different objectives is another item that we have to be keeping an eye on. Thanks.
Thank you. Victor.
So I won't repeat the things that Mireya said because I think many of the things she described are also applicable to Korea. I'll just say I think in addition to the combination of enthusiasm and concerns that Japan has, I would add in the Korea case two more, right? One of them is that once a decision is made in Japan, the industry and government work pretty well hand in hand. They work pretty well hand in hand. And that's not necessarily the case in Korea, particularly with regard to the large conglomerates. So that's one difference that, would make it arguably harder for Korea to cooperate as fully. The other is also that, and I don't know, it may be different now given the election, but in Korea, there are real domestic political obstacles, right? You're dealing with a very unpopular president in Korea who's at consistently at 20%, no matter what he does, and he has no control of the legislature, right? And so there are real political obstacles that he has to deal with, which may be less the case in Japan. The economic coercion or the fear of economic coercion, the shadow of economic coercion is also, it's very real. I mean, in the most prominent case with Japan, Japan found a way to deal with the issue of rare earths, right? It took a decade, but they really reduced their dependence on on China. In Korea's case, there was never really an answer to what happened in 2016 and 2017, except to be very concerned about it, to talk about it, to complain
This is
to
the
the United
THAAD,
States,
yeah.
the THAAD, yeah, because it was a lot, it was broad based. A lot of it was focused on merchandise trade, but it was very broadly based, and there wasn't really a clear solution. I guess what we saw in the aftermath of that is greater South Korean interest in Southeast Asia, right, in South Asia, an effort to try to balance by finding alternative markets. But there was really there wasn't an answer like the Australians had an answer to the beef, barley, and wine tariffs. The Japanese hadn't answered to the rare earth minerals export ban. And then the Chinese also, exercise this leverage every now and then. So there's the case of Mireya, right, where there was a temporary export embargo on urea, which threw the entire economy into a tizzy for a few months. So that is still a very real factor, and with regard to the Korean response. And then just two other quick points. The one is I agree with Mireya on the use of the term de-risking. I mean, personally, I see I know it's a broad umbrella term that's used by the administration with regard to all of this economic security activity, but I really see it applying to things like certain aspects of supply chain resilience, friendshoring, the firm at the State Department, that does impact mitigation for Lithuania and for others who might come under coercion. But these areas that we're talking about, high-end semiconductors, quantum computing, AI, global health, they call this de-risking, but this is decoupling, right? This is not de-risking, and nobody should have any illusions that it's not decoupling, because it is, but it's not decoupling from everything we do with China, but certain crown jewels or key areas, and I think it would behoove allies like Korea to understand that that's reality, right? And that's what and then the second point is, I think Jeremy mentioned IPEF, and I did not, when I talked in my initial thing about, where is the body through which we could think about building the foundation of technology alliances, I didn't mention IPEF. And the reason I didn't mention IPEF, and this goes to our earlier conversation, is I don't know how politically sustainable IPEF is, depending on what happens in a week, right? It may no longer exist in a week, and it could still exist. But if it did, it would be one area, obviously, where there could be the building of these alliances. So,
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Shihoko. So from Taiwan's perspective, as Victor mentioned, that the relationship between the private sector and government sector, the Koreans kind of maintain a distance. I think the distance between the public sector and private sector even be farther than the Korean case, because historically, Taiwan's private sector just moving themselves, right? After the start of the globalization, Taiwan's private sector has been focusing on investing in China. So during that time, our FDIs toward China almost reached to the 8% in the beginning of the 21st century, and it's last about decades. So it's a huge share. However, after China's cost efficient and China's cost, especially the increased cost there in the manufacturing electronic components there in China increased in the middle of 2010. Taiwan's private sector has started to diversify its destination for investing. It's even sooner, earlier than the US-China competition. And of course, after the US-China competition, you can see the speed up of the diversification from Taiwan's private sector. But for Taiwan's government or Taiwanese nationals' benefits or interests, we have, of course, the interest for Taiwan is that we maintain the market share. We maintain the most efficient manufacturing ecosystem here on this island nation. So it's kind of a potentially have a conflict of interest. However, when you see in the first moment that the United States introduced the Chips and Science Act, or before the Chips and Science Act, the Trump administration, the TSMC announced that they're going to invest there in Arizona. So TSMC didn't really optimistic about to bring the manufacturing capacity there to the U.S. soil, because again, it's not about geopolitics. It's about the business. It's about the cost efficiency. Just because about manufacturing semiconductor chips here on the U.S. soil might not achieve the same standard of the cost efficiency. So the TSMC didn't have that kind of interest in investing. However, after the introduction of the Chips and Science Act, of course, the U.S. federal government has promised to bring the subsidies for the TSMC, and then TSMC gradually sees that the U.S. market might be potentially brighter than we previously predicted. Again, this is the kind of a balance, right? How to maintain the TSMC still have the most good looking of its financial balance sheet. Every quarter, they have to review that again. If they diversify their destination for manufacturing, that will be a minus point for their performance. But on the other hand, in terms of the relations with the United States, TSMC or Taiwan barely can say, no, we don't want to go to the States. So it's really a dilemma for Taiwan. So striking the balance that, still maintain Taiwan as the most efficient destination for the concentration of the ecosystem to manufacturing semiconductor chips. However, leveraging any kind of a new potential, any kind of a new condition that to create another foreign offshore site for manufacturing chips, not only for the benefit of the TSMC, but also for the interest of Taiwan. So we are still in the middle way. We still have to wait for it, especially after next week. Maybe there's another totally new page comes. We see the TSMC stock price just dropped after Trump, should say something about like I'm going to tariff TSMC. That kind of threat, of course, Taiwanese people is concerned about. But again, so in the end, we still have to look at the bright side that, to strengthen the relationships with the United States. We should find some best solution for both of these countries, strengthen the interdependence. I think that's the only solution, not only for the TSMC, but also for the surviving of Taiwan.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. You've all been incredibly patient. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yes, the gentleman in the back. We can't hear. Sorry.
Work either in a Taiwanese subsidiary in China or to work at a Chinese company? And how many Chinese engineers go in the other direction? They come from China to go to work in Taiwan.
So the second question is kind of easy because we ban the Chinese workers to work here in Taiwan. So we don't have people have the PRC citizenship that can work in Taiwan, especially in Taiwan's most strategical manufacturing sectors. Some of them might have the Taiwanese residents. That's the rare case. And our intelligence community has been keeping watch about that part. On the other hand, how many Taiwanese engineers or scientists are currently working in China? I don't have a correct number, but previously a lot, obvious, and now it's extremely decreased. It was about so the reason why the engineers just moved back out from China back to Taiwan or move to the States or to Singapore. It was very complex. First of all, China's economy performed not very good. So the opportunities there has become much less than previously. And on the other hand, I think the export control, the EAR 2022 October 7, has a dramatic influence on for the Taiwanese engineers, because most of the Taiwanese engineers also has a U.S. citizenship, so they are the U.S. personnel. So they have been banned after the U.S. introduced the new export control. So many of them left China after the EAR reform. So maybe so because my time's up. So generally, I'm going to answer you like that too. Wait.
All right. So I do apologize. I know there were a few people who wanted to ask questions, but I hope our speakers can stay on and answer your questions individually. I'm very sorry, but thank you for and Andrew again for this opportunity to address this issue. If you could join me in thanking our speakers, Victor Cha, Mireya Solís, and Jeremy Chang. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks everyone for being here. Third panel of the day, last panel of the day. We're standing between you guys and a happy hour drink, so we'll try and keep it interesting. Well, you can have everyone can have their own happy hour drink. Yeah.
Just not on your dime.
My name's Claire Hambrick. I work for TSMC, and we are here to talk about the geopolitics of the semiconductor supply chain. Did you want us to do introductions quickly? I'll let the panelists do their own introductions, and then I'll kick us off with a little intro and start some questions. Mark, you want to take it away?
Mark Lippert, Executive Vice President at Samsung and also the Chief Risk Officer.
Paul Treagle, Director of Government Affairs for Washington, for Tokyo Electron based in Washington, D.C.
Bruce Andrews, I'm the Chief Government Affairs Officer for the Intel Corporation.
Great. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much to Andrew and Stanford for having us all here. The third annual Geopolitics of Technology in East Asia conference. There's been a lot of discussion already about semiconductors, but as y'all know, they're in pretty much everything from your cell phone to your microwave to your refrigerator to the complex military systems that keep us all safe. Much of the past 4 years has been focused on industrial policy. We heard a little bit about that in the last panel. Between the CHIPS Act, which was direct incentives, as well as a tax credit in the United States, other countries, Japan, South Korea, and the EU have also created their own semiconductor incentive programs to lure the supply chain to their shores. There's an immense competition in the industry, but that expands beyond where the fabs are built. Countries analyze the full supply chain of this critical industry and how it can play into the larger geopolitical context. There's complex export controls, deep global supply chains, and the geopolitics of the semiconductor industry are almost as complicated as etching billions of transistors into a semiconductor that can fit on the top of your finger. Today, I have some great panelists with me to talk about this. We'll do some predetermined questions, and then hopefully we'll save a little bit of time for some Q&A. And I'll also do a fun little lightning round for my fellow panelists. So I'll start us off. Since 2020, the industry has moved from near obscurity to the front page news. COVID refocused governments around the world on supply chain resiliency. The CHIPS Act, followed by the chip shortages, made real many of the impacts of the industry on everyday life. All the while, the relationship between the United States and China increasingly deteriorated. The geopolitical realities of this began impacting the semiconductor industry well before the COVID pandemic, however. More aggressive and creative export controls became the norm, including the 2019 FDPR. To my fellow panelists, can each of you discuss how the shift of attention over the past decade has or has not impacted the way your company does business? I'll caveat for everyone in the audience that all of us up here on the panel are relative newbies to our companies, all of us starting within the last 3.5, 4 years. I can answer quickly for TSMC, and then we can just go down the line. I would say over the last 6, 7, 8 years, you've seen a lot of shift in TSMC's behavior in terms of where they have facilities located around the world. Starting in 2019, we began 2018, 2019, looking at the United States, announcing in 2020 that we would be building in Arizona. We have since built in Japan and Europe, as everyone just heard on the last panel. So sure, do geopolitics play into that? Sure, to a certain extent, but also the demands or requests, interests of our customers, we take very seriously. Customers are the most important thing to TSMC, and they ask for diverse supply chains, and we try to provide that for them. Mark?
All right, well, thanks. Great to be back on campus. I wish the football team were doing better. I'm a proud alum of Stanford, but we've fallen on hard times. And I think I was trying to give away 2 tickets and got my original 2 tickets back and 8 more to follow anyway. So
sorry about SMU beating you guys.
Yeah, it's pretty much with the exception of Syracuse, we've really stumbled through the ACC. No, yeah, I know.
So let's be careful.
Anyway, I know. So let me just start by saying, channeling the great Jim March, the late great Jim March, who is a great, one of the great organizational behavior theorists here at Stanford. I do think that the environment in which the company is founded is really important and instructive, and I think stays with it for the duration of the company. And I think you look at the way Samsung was founded, and geopolitics run through its inception, right? It's started as a trading company in Japanese-occupied Korea, complicated machinations in and around World War II. The Korean War essentially makes the original founders start over almost in terms of that. And then you have Cold War, democracy in South Korea. And so it is a company born out of and very familiar with a complicated geopolitical environment, right? And I think that's point one. I think second point is throughout the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, you have seen the US-Korea alliance as a lodestar, not just for most Korean governments, but for many Korean companies. And I think Samsung does feel, that the US-ROC alliance is a really important, or they would say ROC-US alliance. Sorry, back in Korea, I'm reversing it. Used to being the ambassador, right? So I always put the US first. But anyway, I think that's the second part, right? It's like there's a lodestar, there's a North Star there, right? And then I think following that North Star, that's why you see the earliest international fabrication facility in the United States in and around Austin, right? The Samsung Austin Semiconductor SAS, right? And then a doubling down of Taylor in Taylor, Texas. So I think that's the framework, right? But I do echo Claire's sentiment that ultimately these are business decisions, right? Colored by points of emphasis in and around geopolitics. So I think just then a couple of other specific actions that may help inform that I think are instructive here. First, I would point you to a Wall Street Journal article in 2023. It talks about Samsung on the device side, the DX side, the handphones, that part of the business, drawing down from China, but leaving other parts in and around mainland China as well. So I think that's a really important piece. The second piece, I would say, as geopolitics became more of a point of emphasis, and this, you could say, the golden post-war era drew down around 2016, especially. I would say there was much more aggressive management and focus on things like supply chain, logistics, dual sourcing of goods, and that covers a range of different iterations, but everything from, you know, looking hard at where we're getting our materials to engaging with the U.S. Department of Transportation on the Flow Initiative, right? It's a multifaceted endeavor. Then I'd say, and I'll make a couple of last points here and stop. Third, as we made investments in the United States, getting suppliers to co-locate with Samsung. And in Taylor, there are, I think, 24 strategic suppliers that have co-located with Samsung in and around that area. And that's about a $10 billion economic development, I would say, injection into that local community. Fourth, I think also just in concert, I think with that is noting that the business environment in the US is increasingly attractive, right? In a world of instability, you have not only your treaty ally, but also one that is all of a sudden very interested in incentives. And that doesn't just apply to the semiconductor piece of the business. It also applies to other places like the battery business, right? SDI, right? Big incentives. Colin Kahl mentioned the IRA that people always forget about. That is a big incentive package to Samsung. And then finally, just how does it affect operations? Just closer working relationships with governments and multilateral institutions, right? And I think that's an important point there. So again, just to sum up, long history, born out of geopolitics. You know, I think that a lot of non-Korean companies or non-Korean actors got used to a very, what I call it, sort of a golden age, right? 91 to 2016, roughly thereabouts. But most of Samsung history has been in that complicated, dynamic geopolitical environment. And I think it's just almost a reversion to Samsung roots. So let me just stop there.
Thanks, Mark. Paul?
Great. So once again, I'm Paul, working for Tokyo Electron, and I'll maybe take a step back and say, unless you are steeped in the details of the semiconductor industry, you probably don't know who Tokyo Electron is. I had a meeting several months ago with a stakeholder in Washington, D.C. who said, Tokyo Electron, that sounds like a 90s electronica band. And I said, well, it's not, but maybe if this whole semiconductor thing doesn't work out, we have a fallback we can go to. So Tokyo Electron is a Japanese headquartered company, obviously with Tokyo in the name, been around for 61 years. It'll be 61 years next month. And we make semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So what that means is we make the big pieces of equipment that we call tools in the industry that are about the size of about half of this room in some cases, that we then sell to the companies represented by the folks sitting on my right and my left, who are two of our great customers. And we enable the companies like Intel and Samsung and many others to manufacture semiconductor chips. We have a small part of our business focused on flat panel display equipment as well, but really with a focus on semiconductor manufacturing equipment. In terms of our US presence, just for your information, we have about 2,200 employees across the US. That includes R&D, manufacturing, sales, and service professionals. We have our US headquarters in Austin, Texas. We have a manufacturing site in Chaska, Minnesota. And we have an R&D center up in Albany, New York, and I'll talk in more details about all of those in a little bit. But our history is slightly different from what Mark was just describing with Samsung, in that our company has been shaped and involved in issues related to geopolitics. But to be completely honest, our company has been used to being a behind-the-scenes company, focused on our customers, our technology, creating relationships of mutual trust with our customers, and innovating our technology to the best of our ability. But now we've seen that the semiconductor industry has really catapulted to the front of minds for policymakers and in some cases even the general public. And so we have that's resulted in a way in causing us to shift the way in which we do business a little bit by getting more used to the idea of being more forward leaning and externally facing and talking and promoting ourselves, which quite honestly, for basically 58 of our 61 years, we have not done very much of. We've begun paying closer attention to and accounting for the global developments that you mentioned, Claire, and integrating that into some of our risk management processes, into our business planning. And really, this came about by about 3-4 years ago. We realized that with the COVID pandemic and the chip shortage and the geopolitical implications of the relationships between the U.S. and countries in East Asia and around the world, we needed to begin paying a more close attention to these issues. Up to this point, it had been, we are focused on our customers, we're focused on our technology, and to the extent that there are laws and regulations, of course, we will comply with them, but we aren't going to take a proactive role in trying to, monitor them very closely. And that has been a big shift in our business strategy. In 2022, we established a global government affairs function based out of our headquarters in Tokyo. And then last August, so about 14 months ago, we opened up an office in Washington, D.C., which I now lead and have been with the company ever since. Through our investments in the United States, we're committed to the growth of the U.S. Semiconductor ecosystem, and we, of course, intend to grow our presence across the country in the coming years, thanks in no small part to the investments that our customers are making in response to and aided by some of the investments that are being made by the CHIPS and Science Act, which we're all very excited about. But I would say, in response to your question, Claire, and how we've changed and shifted our attention in our business, I think we're now transitioning our internal mindset from being not just a Japanese company that operates globally, but a global company whose headquarters are in Japan. And we are really focused on, making sure that we're able to bring about life-changing technological developments through our customers, not just in the U.S., not just in Japan, but around the world.
All right. Well, it's a tough act to follow. So look, I would say the world has changed in two ways. And, one of them is, it actually really hasn't been the last decade. It's really been the last 5 to 6 years, because I think the world actually has fundamentally changed for this industry. I think back to 2015, 2016, I was the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Commerce Department, and we started a semiconductor initiative. And the number of questions I got of like, why is this industry important? Why would we want to help them and not other industries? Was kind of baffling, because it really is a foundational technology industry, but there was a real lack of understanding of how important the industry was. Fast forward to particularly to COVID, but the Shanghai port shutdown, all the geopolitical tensions we're seeing. And all of a sudden, we're seeing a very different understanding of the importance of this industry and how critical it is. And and if you haven't read, I would suggest Chris Miller's book Chip War is actually a great read that gives kind of the history, or at least the last 50 years of the industry. But I think one of the things that really changed quite fundamentally is, for 30 years, particularly in Asia, particularly Taiwan, South Korea, China, had been very focused. In the US, we didn't really believe in what was called industrial policy. And part of it is we believed, hey, subsidies are a bad idea. The WTO will sort that out. And, basically that everybody just competes and it'll all be fine. Well, the reality is, the industry became very concentrated. So going from 80% in the United States and Europe in 1990 to 80% of production being in Asia now. So the US sort of woke up. And I would say that was this fundamental moment of recognizing that there wasn't diversity or resilience in the global supply chain, whether that's to natural disaster, whether that's to pandemic, whether that is to, political, military, geopolitics, all that stuff. And so the US, the CHIPS Act, was the reaction to that. And it was essentially a recognition of, because of the subsidies and all the other things that take place in Asia, that the U.S. had anywhere from, the low number, which I think is much higher now, is 30%. And I think Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, has been quoted as saying as high as 55% cost differential between manufacturing in the United States and in Asia. So it really did. This was a fundamental transformation. The CHIPS Act was the biggest piece of industrial policy that had been done really in modern history, right? And it has changed. It's led to it's unleashed a massive amount of investment in the United States. I mean, by SIA, the Semiconductor Industry Association analysis of $500 billion worth of investment has resulted or has been planned in the United States. So really a fundamental transformation. So the world was one thing that changed, but also for us as a company, Intel has also changed. You know, I mean, we're sitting in the middle of Silicon Valley, and the name Silicon, of course, comes from silicon. And as my CEO often says, you know, Intel is the company that put silicon in Silicon Valley. And for 50 years, we were, you know, basically every major innovation that's taken place. You know, ASML wouldn't exist without, you know, Intel being a 40% investor and helping it come forward. But we'd always been a very insular and interior focused company. You know, we didn't manufacture for others. We only manufactured for ourselves. And, you know, the challenge of all that is there are really only 3 companies in the world that can make the most advanced logic semiconductors. And you're actually looking at all 3 sitting at this table. So TSMC, Samsung, Intel, that's it. It's not, there's no one else in the world who can make the most advanced semiconductors. And so we as a company always just designed and manufactured for ourselves. And what I think we realized out of this sort of change that's really taken place, you know, the last 10 years is probably the biggest, but particularly in the recent years, is that there needs to be a third company that can do this, not just for our own needs and our own products, but really for other customers. Because to have the resilience we need globally, we really do need more competition and having particularly a broader geographic base. So, you know, we've announced over $100 billion investments in the United States. We're looking at a number of projects overseas as well, but we really focused and doubled down on the US because I think there was a recognition that the US, particularly once Congress took action with the CHIPS Act and the Biden administration to close that cost gap, you actually could manufacture competitively in the United States. And so that's a real sea change.
Thanks. That's brought up a few follow-up questions from me. You know, Mark mentioned that part of bringing facilities to the US includes bringing suppliers and creating an ecosystem. You know, Bruce, Intel is a large global company and has been globally manufacturing for a very long time versus, you know, a company like TSMC, which recently started our global footprint expansion. Can you talk about, you know, some of these changes that we've seen since you said 2025, or 2015? How has that impacted Intel specifically, considering their larger geographical footprint?
Yeah, so we've actually always been very successful at having a large geographic footprint. You know, we're the biggest employer in Israel. We're one of the biggest, and we were the first tech company that sort of started the Israeli tech, you know, boom. We're a big employer in Ireland. We're in Malaysia. We're in Vietnam. We're in China. We're in a number of Costa Rica. And you know, what we found is actually having a globally diverse network actually works well for us. And you know, it's been something that's actually been quite successful over the course of the years. But to your point, Claire, it's become much more challenging to navigate the geopolitics of this. You know, and there's really 2 things. I mean, one is there is navigating, you know, U.S. export controls, U.S. focus on technology controls on China, but also, well, frankly, trying to be successful in the China market. You know, the Chinese market is one that is critically important to the semiconductor industry. You know, the Chinese market is about 30% of global demand, and probably around 50% of all semiconductors go through China at one point in time. So finding that balance, and frankly, it's not just us, it's really the entire industry, being able to be successful in the Chinese market, but also navigating, you know, what is a pretty intense geopolitical period. You know, there's obviously the U.S. government is very focused on not having the most advanced technology go to China. You know, and then there's also having a global network, right? So, you know, just as an example, in the CHIPS Act, Congress included what they call the guardrails provision, which basically limits that any company that takes CHIPS money can't do manufacturing past a certain level of advancement in China. And that's just one example of the many things that, you know, prior to all this, we really didn't have to worry about, right? It was a very open and, I would sort of say probably the greatest example of a global industry where a semiconductor wafer, the inputs can start in Japan and the machinery can come from Japan and from Germany and Europe and Netherlands. And then it goes to the United States, it goes to somewhere in Asia, it travels around the world. I mean, you watch the journey of one of our semiconductors and it's amazing. I wish they're getting the frequent flyer miles that those wafers get. But the point being is it really is it has become a much more global industry, and particularly dealing with not just the export controls, but all the trade provisions that, and the complexities of moving goods over borders and all the different rules and requirements that really didn't exist in the past, but it's become a much more complicated industry.
Great. Mark, I know that South Korea controls about 2/3 of the memory market and a super robust semiconductor system. For the most part, not for the most part, but a lot of the attention in export control policy is on the advanced logic leading edge. Can you talk a little bit about how that might shift, seen as, high bandwidth memory is super integral to AI just as much as advanced logic? How does that play, the multilateral controls and export controls play into kind of the future with memory being so important to AI?
Well, I mean, I think it dovetails with what the earlier panelists, earlier panels were talking about, right? I mean, I think, for better or for worse, you're seeing an acceleration of camps, right? And Matt Pottinger was calling it an axis. Colin call it another a funnier way of saying it, but bottom line is that you are seeing the world on geopolitical terms starting to, I wouldn't say completely fall into two camps, but start to move in that direction, and I would argue accelerate in that direction over the past years and the past year. And I think Matt was mentioning it on the first panel, but the inclusion of North Korea into the Russian efforts in Ukraine, I think, really underscores that we're now hurtling at a much faster rate on some sort of geopolitical, I don't want to say realignment, but just some sort of directional, I guess, phenomenon that's out there, right? And it's still evolving, but I think it's basically showing us where the world is going in terms of geopolitics. And as this panel rightly noted, and you noted, Claire, closely linked to that is technology, right? And from the technology comes export controls. It also comes industrial policy that Bruce mentioned, and it comes with technological alliances that Victor was mentioning, and referencing Jim Lewis at CSIS on the previous panel. So I think the bottom line here is that technology and technological controls tend to be following geopolitics these days, and the geopolitics are moving in a pretty clear and accelerating direction. And let me just stop there.
Great. Another area of focus for export controls are tool makers. Paul, can you talk a little bit about that and how your company has navigated the focus on tool makers?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great question, Claire. I think if you take a step back and you kind of think about, well, why are governments implementing export controls in the first place? It's really a question of national security. And export controls are kind of meant to address national security concerns that countries may have. So obviously, we as a company, Tokyo Electron, recognize the importance of semiconductors to national security. And one of the things that we've been supporting is kind of the collaborative efforts between the US and the Japanese and the Dutch and other countries as well to address the concerns that these countries have in this space. But when it comes to deciding what national security issues are and how to address them, from our perspective, that's not really an issue that is up to private companies to determine, but rather a negotiation left to the governments to decide amongst themselves. So to that end, really our main priority in this space is compliance, and our full compliance with US, Japanese, whichever other country may have jurisdiction over our operations, all of the laws and regulations of those governments, whether it be export controls and everything else. And ensuring our compliance with the laws and regulations of export controls making it so that influences the way we conduct business is our top priority as a company. I'd also say that that you mentioned the multilateral aspect of this, and we really believe that the dialogues between these governments that I mentioned are important to address mutual concerns and to help really avoid undermining the potential collaboration that could take place and that's really necessary to drive innovation. So we're not just talking about semiconductor innovation within the United States or in Japan or just within one small area, but really how do we bring in friends and partners and other countries to collaborate in this space. So to that end, we're as I sort of mentioned in my first answer, what we view it as positively contributing to the U.S. semiconductor ecosystem and providing investments and support for our customers that are in the U.S. and any other market where they exist. I'd say at Tokyo Electron, we have three what we call success factors that we use to measure our company's growth, and they are people, investment, and technology. And actually, if you look at the promotion strategy that the U.S. government is pursuing, it's workforce development, it's investment through the CHIPS Act, through funding credits, incentives, things like that, and then of course R&D programs. So if you look at people, workforce development, investment, and CHIPS Act and other types of funding, and then technology and R&D, there's actually quite a good amount of alignment between our priorities and the priorities of the U.S. government when it comes to promotion, for instance, and that's not a coincidence, I would say. So we are really focusing on strengthening the technology and R&D cooperation between our company and making sure that we are a good contributor to the U.S. and global semiconductor ecosystems. I'll expand on that a bit and say that we've been in the United States for more than 30 years. We really plan on growing a lot over the next 5-10 years here in the U.S. I mentioned in my first answer the R&D center we have in New York. That's the nanotech complex up on the campus of SUNY Albany there. We've been there for more than 20 years. We're one of the two founding tenants at that center up in Albany, along with IBM. And it's the largest integrated R&D center in the world. And it's also a public-private partnership. And so we view that is a nice example of the ways in which different actors can come and collaborate in this space. We also, as I mentioned, have a manufacturing site in Chaska, Minnesota, which we're making investments in, and we're dubbing that our fourth factory. So it's going to be even greater and grander than it is now. And the reason I mentioned that is because we have an initiative within Tokyo Electron that we're really proud of called the Lab to Fab concept. And basically what that does is that takes the R&D that we do in Albany, gets that we bring that to our manufacturing site in Minnesota, and then we work in collaboration with our customers to integrate that into our products and to deliver leading edge solutions and technologies for our customers to enable them to do whatever it is that they need to do. So we think that that's part of accelerating the speed of innovation in the United States and, of course, in Japan. And the previous panel mentioned Rapidus. And actually, the chairman of Rapidus is the former CEO of Tokyo Electron. And he was around at TEL when the nanotech complex in upstate New York was founded. And so the Rapidus development is actually in no small part based off of the success that's taken place in a certain sense in Albany. One other thing I'll just mention, in case any of you are tuning in online or in Texas, but we are, something we're super excited about there is that we're actually relocating our U.S. headquarters within the city of Austin we're splitting it in half and bringing part of it right downtown. And then the other part, we're just putting a few blocks away from our existing headquarters, and we're doubling the square footage of our training and tech center. So what that is it's a facility where we bring our employees and our customers' employees from around the country and in some cases around the world to train on our tools before they go out onto the floor of a fab. And that's another way in which we're kind of trying to foster greater collaboration within the semiconductor ecosystem in the United States. So I say all that to say that, export controls are, of course, something we pay very, very close attention to. We need to. it has resulted in my personally reading the more pages of the Federal Register that I care to admit, and that I don't want to think about at this time. But you know, it's an example of the unwavering commitment that we have to our customers, to advancing our technology, to being good corporate citizens, and to really focusing in on not just what do we need to do in terms of compliance, but what do we need to do in terms of fostering greater collaboration when it comes to semiconductor innovation.
Can I just come in on that? You know, at the outset, I might quibble a bit and just say, I think industry needs a seat at the table on export control rulemaking. I think it's vitally important. And having served in government for 20 years, especially in the Pentagon, where with, you know, I would say the one place where industrial policy existed prior to Bruce's comments about the greatest, you know, the biggest industrial policy kind of initiative in history. You know, the Pentagon takes industrial policy very seriously and invites industry in to have a direct dialogue, right? And I think that's punctuated by what Ash Carter used to say when he was both deputy and SecDef, probably the leading, other than William Perry, the best technologist secretary that had ever sat in that seat, was we make nothing in this building, right? And so the health of the industrial base is absolutely critical, and rules pursuant, or rules that impact rather, that industrial base are critical, right? And why do you bring industry in? You bring them in because you want information, right? You're sitting in you're sitting in Northern Virginia trying to make decisions about an industry that is far-flung and global, as Bruce mentioned. I think that's one. And two, you know, part of leading competition or dealing with export controls is that export controls are designed generally to slow things down. That's probably the best you're going to do with export controls. And to maximize the efficacy of export controls, it means that industry that you are championing, as you sit in government, I'm speaking from my experience on Samsung, you need them to run faster, right? And so if your export controls clips inadvertently because you're not sensitive or you're not talking to industry, you've really undermined the purpose of the export control, or at least reduced its efficacy dramatically. So I'm a strong believer in deep and abiding dialogue between industry and governments. And I'll just get off the stage by previewing tomorrow. I think you're going to have Matt Borman here, who really makes it his mission to reach out to industry, right? And was a former colleague of Bruce's in the Commerce Department. And I think that's what makes him such an effective civil servant, is he's hungry for industry's perspective when he's trying to make hard calls and recommendations on really important and complicated rules. Let me just stop there.
Great. Also, always feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
It's much more interesting than me just asking predetermined questions. Bruce, can you talk a little bit more about the elections in the US? I know there's been a lot of ink spilled today already in this room on that, but particularly to the semiconductor industry. You mentioned earlier being in conversations in 2015 on semiconductors and the importance, and what a lot of people forget is one of the last things the Biden administration did on their way out was publish a paper about the importance of semiconductor manufacturing and reshoring it in the United States. It was picked up.
Obama administration.
Oh, sorry, that's what I meant. I meant the Obama administration. Thank you. And then the Trump administration picked that up and ran with it, and it was continued through the Biden administration. Will we see a further continuance, do you think, regarding semiconductor industrial policy in either the Harris or a second Trump administration?
Well, first thing, I'm glad you didn't ask me to prognosticate on the election. I'm going to leave that to Mark and to Paul, because that's a tough one. Look, I mean, the thing that's so interesting about this is it has had bipartisan support. I mean, to your point, we had a whole initiative during the Obama administration, during the last year, to promote the semiconductor industry, really when nobody was talking about it. Trump team picked it up. You know, the CHIPS Act, one of the little known facts, although if President Trump wins, we'll hear a lot more about it, is that the CHIPS Act really did start under the Trump administration, and they did a significant amount of work, particularly, I think, actually to get TSMC to come to Arizona. So I think there was a recognition that the U.S. was not competitive at that point in time because of the cost differential. So, you know, and unfortunately, the CHIPS Act was very bipartisan in the Senate. There was some machinations at the end that made a much smaller Republican vote in the House than I think there otherwise would have been, that wasn't really wasn't really connected to the substantive issues. It was more about the politics at that time. But the Biden administration's really picked up the CHIPS Act and run with it. And, to the credit of Secretary Raimondo, Senator Schumer, but also folks like Senator Cornyn, Senator Young, leaders in the House. It was Mike McCall, who's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, has done a phenomenal job championing this issue. So I do think there is much more bipartisan support that often gets recognized. With that said, I do expect continuity. I got to be honest. Reading the President Trump's comments from his Joe Rogan interview last week, where he basically said, "Yeah, we're just going to get rid of the CHIPS Act and we're going to do tariffs," was a curveball that maybe you guys saw coming. That was a little surprise on my part. But I do hope that the bipartisanship and the recognition that this is a remarkably important issue, not just to U.S. economic security, but also to national security. And so my expectation is that this will continue with strong bipartisan support. And, I do think it a little bit, both this and the second part of your question about geopolitics is a little bit going to depend on who comes into some of the key jobs in the next administration. There's an old saying that personnel is policy, and I think that's actually very true. The differences between certain personalities, this is like not, I don't know who will be in either administration if they win, but I'll give you an example. There's names, if you read Politico or Axios, they talk about, Bob Lighthizer as a potential Secretary of Commerce versus a Linda McMahon. I think they would take very different approaches, is my read of where they come from on how policy is approached. Same thing in the Harris administration. You could see very different outcomes depending on who comes into some of these key jobs. I would say that's even more true on geopolitics and China policy. I mean, the one thing I am very comfortable saying is you'll see a continuation of what have been strong focus on export controls and limiting technology goes to China, regardless of whether Harris or Trump wins. With that said, the approach and the style and how they'll do it, right, is actually very different. President Trump is, as we learned when he lifted the limitations on ZTE, he looks at a bunch of other factors and doesn't just look at the export controls in itself. Who ends up in key policy positions? You mentioned Matt Pottinger earlier, for example, really smart guy who, has a really strong passion in this area. That'd be very different than someone else if they end up as, say, national security advisor or something else. So while I think the overall directions are going to be similar, I think the nuance in some of the policies could be very different depending on both who wins, but also who occupies key jobs in the administration.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask Paul to very quickly comment a little bit on the recent elections in Japan this week. The LDP party that's been very strongly supportive of semiconductor incentives did lose a lot of seats. What do we think will happen there?
Yeah, I mean, Japan decided to steal a little bit of the U.S.'s thunder here and have an election prior to next week, which was, I think the results in some cases were surprising. Listen, I mean, I think Japan and the U.S. have a mutually complementary relationship in the semiconductor industry, and so that relationship will not change based on the results of either the Japanese election or what happens here in the U.S. Next week. I mean, speaking more generally and from my personal perspective, I mean, I think there's little doubt that the U.S.-Japan alliance will continue in some form or fashion, and that support for the semiconductor industry in Japan will continue, given the investments that have already begun to be made in things like bringing TSMC into Kumamoto and Rapidus and other investments that are taking place there. Between the U.S. and Japan, it's one of the strongest and most critical alliances for either country, really. Japan is the #1 provider of foreign direct investment into the United States. And they've had, the two countries have had a mutual defense treaty since 1952. And of course, Japan is a critical geopolitical partner in East Asia for the United States, and the U.S. is a critical trading partner for Japan. So I think those economic ties will make it so that, either administration in either country will recognize the importance of maintaining very strong bilateral ties between the two countries and integrating the two countries' relationship into broader plurilateral and multilateral discussions. And you know, one thing that I would say as well on the topic of export controls is it's interesting if you look back at October 7th, 2022, when the US announced and implemented their first tranche of export controls. Since then to now, and that was followed soon thereafter by controls in Japan and the Netherlands, the administrations in the United States as of next January, no matter what happens next week, the administrations in the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands will all be different from how they were in 2022. So very interesting. You know, I'm not going to make a prognostication for what might happen as a result of that, but I think those political dynamics will be interesting to watch. But the foundation for the strong relationship and strong cooperation, especially in the semiconductor industry and other parts, I think is going to remain for many years to come.
Awesome. Mark, I'm going to ask you a super quick question because I did promise Q&A. But one thing we haven't talked a lot about yet is personnel and how personnel play into the geopolitical tensions. And traditionally, R&D has been a very global focus, and particularly in academia, you know, very little boundaries and borders when it comes to academic research. How has that changed, considering the geopolitical tensions we've seen, and how has that affected the industry?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think, you know, you're seeing, not at the risk of repeating myself, a similar dynamic in camps, geopolitics, technology, R&D following. And I think, you know, there's understandable reasons for some of that. On the other hand, I think you've got a situation where, you know, the competition in geopolitics and geotechnology can work inadvertently across purposes, right? Because you've got national security concerns, commercial concerns, but also Colin Kahl talked about it, the power of innovation, right? In terms of humanitarian needs and just improving everybody's everyday lives, right? So I think that is a space to watch very, very carefully going forward. Maybe just to get off the stage to get to Q&A, I'd also say that I think that when we are thinking through, and this applies more broadly to export controls, but also to R&D collaboration on how to approach it from a public policy standpoint, we have to remember that there is not necessarily a monopoly on some of the technologies or many of the technologies in some of these countries, right? So collaboration at some level is important, not just because you want to lead to the best outcome in the R&D space, but also selfishly because you want to be closer to others who may have something or have insights or innovation that you don't. And I think, you know, it just gets to the point of sort of walling off maybe one country, the United States, and saying, well, it's all here, we'll just hold it in. That model doesn't apply anymore. And I think that thinking needs to evolve as we move forward on, you know, promulgation of export controls and other related policies and regulations. Stop there.
Awesome. I do have lightning rounds, but I'll ask some Q&A from the audience first, and then we'll end on lightning round. All right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dan Snyder from East Asian Studies here at Stanford. So I'd like to ask you about your evaluation of the impact and effectiveness of export controls on China. To what degree have you lost market share in China as a result of this? And how do you evaluate the Chinese ability to innovate and develop their own domestic sources of technology to replace those that have been cut off or potentially cut off by export controls? So there's an argument out there that export controls actually have been very ineffective, in some ways have spurred innovation and development in China. And I wonder what, from the perspective of your firms, what you think about that.
I'll let you go first, Mark.
I mean, I won't speak for Samsung. I'll just say, you know, I think the jury's still out, Dan. You know, these are early days, right? They were just put in place a year. Well, first, let me just say, I think your theory of the case is interesting, right? I think it's a very yes, other people's theory. The case that you posit. I think that look, when I was at Boeing, we were saying the same thing about Chinese commercial aircraft development, right? In terms of, are these controls going to take a program that is kind of bumping along and accelerate it? Because the Chinese seemed at the time relatively content to let their commercial aviation program, proceed, but also continue to purchase large quantities of Airbus and Boeing product, right? And will controls or in this case tariffs accelerate that, right? I think that's really the question. And my answer personally is it's too soon to tell, right? And I think it gets down to a complicated mix of two things, right? Or I'll simplify it by two or three things, and I, at the risk of repeating myself. One, do the export controls actually work? Are they appropriately targeted to get at the problem that you need to solve, right? That's one. Within that bucket, is it buying time, right? Time and space for your other champions? And how does that affect the behavior of the affected country, right? Does it trigger more activity, or does it trigger activity that is already inefficient and upgun that, right? So I think that's one. And then the second part is it impacting your own industry in a way that adversely impacts it to run faster, right? Because that's the point, right? Export controls, I think anybody will argue eventually, countries, any sovereign country can get around them with enough time and money and attention and resources, almost any country. It's just how long will it take them, and what do you do with that time? And I think the jury is largely out on that. Let me stop there.
And let me just add to that, because Mark took a big part of what I was going to say. But look, I think you've got to look at the time frame, right? In the short term, absolutely, there's certain technologies and products that the Chinese are not able to make, and I think that's one of the focuses of U.S. export controls, is to slow them down. So GPU AI accelerator chips, right? That's something that they're not able to do, and particularly because they don't have access to the most advanced manufacturing, so that they can't make them at the smaller levels. But I think Mark's point is also right. With enough time and money, the question is that going to hold? I mean, on one level, there's certain things that are really hard to do. And I know less about the Tokyo Electron machines than I do about the ASML, advanced EUV lithography. That is remarkably hard. You can have the plans, you can understand it. It's still super hard to do. And one of the things we often point out is export controls don't work on things that are either replicable or they can get nearly as good, right? So if you're export controlling something that somebody can get to 80% of, that's not really going to be effective in the long term. If you have something that is like truly a choke point that can't be that you basically just can't do, that becomes an effective export control. But I think there was an article today, I think it was in the New York Times, but I think it was in a couple publications, looking at various sectors where where the Chinese have dominated in certain areas. So EVs, batteries, solar, they have proved remarkably effective. I think there is a little bit of a fallacy in the United States that the Chinese just steal IP and that they're never going to catch up, that somehow we Western countries are more innovative. The thing I always tell my friends in the US government, I'm like, don't be fooled. Huawei is one of the most innovative companies in the world. People should not be fooled by the fact that they're very smart, they're spending a lot of money, and they're proving to be able to be successful in catching up in a lot of these technologies. So in the short term, sure, they'll be effective, but to your point, is there collateral damage in the long term of doing these things, but actually incentivizing investment and competition with, whether it's US, Korean, Japanese company, Taiwanese companies that are in these spaces? We'll see if the long-term impact, if we actually do more damage than, the benefit that's gotten in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't have much to add to what my esteemed colleagues here have said. I'll just mention a few small things. If you look at the market dynamics from a semiconductor equipment point of view, one of the things that Tokyo Electron and our peer companies have seen is that as a result or in response to export controls, some customers in China have actually pivoted their manufacturing focus away from advanced node semiconductors to legacy node semiconductors. And as a result, if you look at earnings reports from several companies in this space, there was some increased demand for tools as a result of that pivot from focus from our customers, as well as, you know, the semiconductor industry is cyclical, right? So there was a downturn corresponding to that time from some demand from elsewhere in the world. And so sales to China actually went up as a result in some part because of export controls, because of that focus on the legacy chips. We expect that to kind of normalize in the near term. But, you know, speaking personally and echoing the answers of my colleagues here, you know, innovation doesn't stop at shores and borders. And that's why I think some of my remarks earlier today have been focused on kind of this promotion, this innovation, this cross collaboration, because, you know, export controls focused on semiconductors may be able to slow down certain development in certain areas, but ultimately, as Mark said, it's going to be about who can run faster.
Any other-
Can I just add a good question for Matt Borman tomorrow, right? So there you go. Stay tuned for tomorrow's session.
Are there any other questions?
From TSMC's point of view?
I mean, I think that my colleagues really answered the question quite well. You can look at all of our revenues that changed over since 2020 when the FDPR went into effect, and a large share of the revenue from TSMC shifted away from China. There's huge demand globally. We made up that demand elsewhere in the US, making up a large part of that. 65 to 70% of our revenues from the US, depending on the quarter, and a lot of that has to do with the shifting market away at the higher end, higher expense nodes. Any other questions? I have lightning round questions, which I'm very happy to go. Dan did steal one of mine, so thank you. What would y'all say is your assessment of friendshoring in Latin America, particularly towards the ecosystem and our suppliers? And lightning round means like 10 words or less.
Sure, I'll start. Look, I think there's a huge opportunity, particularly in Mexico. I don't think they've necessarily captured that yet, but I think in the long term, there's absolutely opportunity, and that's particularly going to be true if there's more instability in Asia.
Yeah, I'll say, you know, Tokyo Electron goes where our customers go. So to the extent that Intel, Samsung, and others invest more in countries in Latin America, we will go there as well. I mean, personally, I hope that it is successful and that I get to take some work trips to Costa Rica, but we'll see.
If you want to come visit our plant, you're invited anytime.
I appreciate that. I'll take you up on that offer.
I'll yield back.
Okay. What was the biggest surprise of the past year in the industry?
Mark, you could
well, that the Samsung Lions, our baseball team, made the Korean series.
That's a good one.
Time in like 10 years. I guess my own personal one would be having worked at, I know it's 10 words, but just quickly, having worked at Google, I was steeped in AI. I'm surprised in DC how the AI debate just lit so quickly and has had so many impacts in such a short time. To dovetail to the first panel with Colin, even restoking the debate around nuclear energy. Stop there.
Yeah, mine is, you know, maybe I shouldn't be surprised by this, but I am still surprised about the fact that a fix to the R&D amortization and deduction issue made it through the House, but couldn't get through the Senate. I will. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, Mark took my AI, so I would just say that we haven't seen any CHIPS Act money go out yet. That the implementation has been, frankly, much slower than I would have expected when the law passed 2.5 years ago.
True. All right. You'll never know the rest of the lightning round questions. I'm sorry about that, but we're at time. I hope
king for the day.
Yeah, I know you missed the if you were king for the day question. Sorry. Thank you to Stanford for hosting us, and thank you all for being here. And thank you to my fellow panelists.
Yeah, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
All right, guys, that concludes our program for the day. I want to thank all of you for coming and our panelists as well. We will reconvene tomorrow here, same place. The program starts at 10 a.m. with Matt Foreman. Doors will open at 9:15. I hope to see you then. Take care.